12 of Introduction to Philosophy. Today we're going to talk about and read a bit of Meditations by René Descartes. But first, a joke. An old man goes to his doctor. He says, "Doctor, I think my wife is going deaf. How can I tell?" Doctor says, "It's easy. Go home, stand 20 feet behind her, ask her a question. If she doesn't answer, move 10 feet behind her, ask her the same question. If not, go directly behind her, repeat the question." So he does. He goes home, he says, "What's for supper?" No answer. So 10 feet behind her, he says, "What's for supper?" No answer. Gets right behind her, says, "What's for supper?" And she says, "For the third time, pork chops." So who's going deaf? This is a question Descartes raises. How much of it, if I have a perception of the world, how much of it is my perception of the world, and how much of it is my perception of the world? Is the world going deaf to me, or am I going deaf to the world? Maybe it's you. Doesn't it seem strange that cleaners would shrink all of your pants? Mark Twain said of his father, my father used to tell me this story. I didn't get it for a while, eventually did. "When I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished by how much he had learned in 7 years." When we attempt to perceive an object, let's say a tree, my perception of the object interposes itself between that putative object and myself. Now it's a question, can I get beyond my perception to the object? I think I perceive the thing in itself, as it were. Or is the phenomenon I am perceiving nothing more, perhaps, than my subjective perception of it? Or if it is more, maybe I cannot get beyond that subjective perception to the thing in itself. René Descartes is often called the first modern philosopher. Here's exactly why. Because he's the first one to recognize that before we can talk about the world which exists objectively outside of ourselves, we have to first address the question of the perceiving subject, myself in this case, to understand that my perception of the world is my perception of the world before we might possibly go on to ask about its status in relation to the world. And he's the first modern philosopher because his starting point is going to be followed ever since by folks like Kant, like Hegel, like Marx, like Jean-Paul Sartre, indeed many others. So the first modern philosopher, and yet at the same time, René Descartes is kind of a Janus-faced figure, like the Roman god Janus. We name our month January after him, looking simultaneously backwards and forwards. And there's this aspect also to Descartes. In some ways he was old school, in some ways he was modern. He wrote in Latin, the old language of scholarship in the Middle Ages. He was familiar with medieval fantasy beasts. He talks about hippogriffs and chimeras, etc. He doesn't believe in them, but the thing is, he can talk about these and they don't need to be explained. His audience understands them. They're too rooted in this kind of older fantasy world. He was educated in the church. He embraces an older metaphysics of decline from a golden age and metaphysics entropy, as we'll see. And he has in particular some very old, outmoded ideas about physics. For example, about the transfer of heat. We'll look at that when we come to that argument. On the other hand, he also wrote in the vernacular. His language was French. In fact, he wrote in Latin and translated into French himself, so as to be more widely understood. Vernacular languages at this time, this is just a little after the Reformation, and that was an issue with scriptures becoming more and more in use. Latin was declining. He's modern, and also that he starts from subjective consciousness. That's what makes him the first modern philosopher. He was educated in the church, yes, but he was educated by this newfangled order called the Jesuits. He was very much an enthusiast for the new science developing in the 17th century. And like the newfangled Jesuit order, he's going to use introspection when he talks about human nature. He's going to look within himself. I'm a human being, he says, so how better to address that question than to look inwardly. This is, by the way, the standard French school edition of the work we're going to be reading. It's in one page in Latin, the other page in French. That's still the standard presentation today. Now, Descartes favors the new science developing in his time. The Royal Society, Galileo, von Leeuwenhoek and his microscope, Harvey and the circulation of the blood. But that was only barely developed in his time. And his own intentions apart, he still remains wedded to some physical ideas that go back to Aristotle and to pre-modern understanding. For example, the notion that the Earth is relatively young. It still has not dawned on scholars yet that Archbishop Usher, who in the 17th century dated the world, the origin of the world and the universe, because in the Bible they are the same, to precisely 9 a.m., October 23rd, in the year 4004 BC. This comes out, for example, Descartes uses the example of a stone. He says, look, this stone is as it is because God created it that way, and has more reality in him than the stone does. The creator has, the cause of something has more reality than the thing that it causes. We look at that same stone and we see it rather differently. The stone wasn't that way originally. It's been broken off from a larger chunk of stone, probably tumbled for eons through a stream like this to get to be like these other stones in the stream are. And Descartes has, nor did anyone in his time, has no clue about this basic fact. And again, although he doesn't endorse the older mythology, he's still rooted in a world in which people can talk, unself-consciously about things like chimeras, hippogriffs, and satyrs. Buckbeak, remember Buckbeak from Harry Potter? He's a hippogriff, half horse and half griffin, basically. Hippo is Greek for horse. And chimeras, beasts composed of various different sorts of animals. Got a question. What do you get if you cross an elephant and a rhino? Elephino. Yeah, people still do this for fun. There's the Wolpertinger in Bavaria and Austria. The squirrel with the antlers, and so forth. Ooh, Bullwinkle and Rocky, I don't know. Well, you may recall, because we've talked about Descartes already, haven't we, in terms of rationalism and empiricism. He was worried about the question, can I know anything? And that's characteristically Descartes' question. Not the only question one can ask about knowledge. For example, Kant asks a very different question. Kant says, it's pretty clear that we know a lot of stuff. The question is, how is it possible that we know what we know? Descartes, though, starts by asking, can we find some foundations for our knowledge? And he comes to the conclusion very quickly that many of the things that he's been told that he knows, thought that he knew, might very well be mistaken. Even things which seemed obvious to him could be questioned. We might be deceived. And we might be deceived some of the time. We might even be deceived about things all of the time. How do we know that we're not? So, of course, he hit on, as we know, this is again by way of review for the class, the Cartesian method. If only one could find some idea that could not be doubted, one starts to do that by doubting everything until or unless that thing pops up. Now, this day may never come, as the Godfather says, but maybe it will. This general kind of view that Descartes adopts is known as foundationalism. Think about the story from the Gospels. The wise man builds his house on the rock. The foolish man builds his house on the sand. When it rains, guess whose house is standing? And if you take a foundationalist approach, as Descartes does, you look for some foundational bedrock beliefs on which you can then build, if you will, some inferential beliefs later on. But the inferential beliefs will only be as good, no better, than the foundational beliefs on which they rest. At least that is the goal. But Descartes realizes that before you build, you got to do the tear down. And so he takes a rather radical and bold method. I'm going to do a spring house cleaning of my head. I'm going to take out everything that I could possibly doubt, even if it might be true. If it's not 100% probable, that's what certainty is, then I'm going to treat it as if it were 100% false and empty it all out until or unless I find that one thing that I cannot doubt, whatever that might be. So he starts down the Cartesian road, just like, leave that alone for a minute. But just to go down the Cartesian road, let's say. And of course, we know where this is going. We've been there before, right? Cogito ergo sum. He finally he hits on something that he cannot doubt. I think, therefore I am. my own existence. As long as I'm thinking, I cannot doubt that I am thinking. As long as I'm doubting, I cannot doubt that I'm doubting, and that there is a doubter doing the doubting me. That's indubitable. Can't deny it. And the audience of the work we're about to read also knew this, because Descartes published it in an earlier work, The Discourse on Method, 1637 now and 1640. The document we're going to read starting today restates this and expands upon it. And there's a literary conceit at work here. You know, Descartes would get up in the morning really early, and he would stoke up the fire because, you know, lived in a cold climate, and put on his dressing gown, bathrobe, go back into bed, pull the covers over, and then he'd start to read and he'd write. He'd do that until late morning, maybe about lunchtime, get out of bed, get dressed, go down to lunch, do whatever you want to do the rest of the day, come back, go to sleep, and next morning would repeat the whole process all over again. Typical Frenchman, does his best work in bed. And he wrote 6 meditations, and as you read them, it's as if he was waking up in the morning and starting a new meditation, and we're kind of reading over his shoulder as he's writing this all down. Lying in bed, he also discovered coordinate geometry. And there was a fly on the ceiling, and he asked himself, how could I possibly describe the exact position of this fly? And so he worked out the XY coordinates, you know, XY axis scheme that we now use very often for a variety of purposes. So here we are. In the Museum of Improbable Entities, Descartes' dressing gown sits there alongside Freud's first slip. You know Freudian slip, right? It's when you say one thing and mean your mother, you mean another. Yes. Okay, so the first meditation. Oops. On what can be called into doubt. So we're reading from page 497 in the second edition, Poyman's Classics. Meditations on the First Philosophy, in which are demonstrated the existence of God and the distinction between the human soul and the body. What could be called to doubt? First meditation. Some years ago, I was struck by the large number of falsehoods that I had accepted as true in my childhood, and by the highly doubtful nature of the whole edifice that I had subsequently based on them. I realized that it was necessary once in the course of my life to demolish everything completely and start again right from the foundations if I wanted to establish anything at all in the sciences that was stable and likely to last. But the task looked an enormous one, and I began to wait until I should reach a mature enough age to ensure that no subsequent time of life would be more suitable for tackling such inquiries. This led me to put off the project for so long that I would now be to blame if, by pondering over it any further, I wasted the time still left for carrying it out. So today, I have expressly rid my mind of all worries and arranged for myself a clear stretch of free time. I'm here quite alone, and at last I will devote myself sincerely and without reservation to the general demolition of my opinions. But to accomplish this, it will not be necessary for me to show that all my opinions are false, which is something I could perhaps never manage. Reason now leads me to think that I should hold back my assent from opinions which are not completely certain and indubitable, just as carefully as I do from those which are patently false. So, for the purpose of rejecting all my opinions, it will be enough if I find in each of them at least some reason for doubt. And to do this, I will not need to run through them all individually, which would be an endless task. Once the foundations of a building are undermined, anything built on them collapses of its own accord. So I will go straight for the basic principles on which all my former beliefs rested. Whatever I have up until now accepted as most true, I have acquired either from the senses or through the senses. But from time to time, I found that the senses deceive, and it is prudent never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. Once a thief, always a thief. Yet, although the senses occasionally deceive us with respect to objects which are very small or in the distance, there are many other beliefs about which doubt is quite impossible, even though they are derived from the senses. For example, that I'm here, sitting by the fire, wearing a winter dressing gown, holding this piece of paper in my hands, and so on. Again, how could it be denied that these hands or this whole body are mine? Unless perhaps I were to liken myself to madmen whose brains are so damaged by the persistent vapors of melancholia that they firmly maintain they are kings when they are paupers, or say that they are dressed in purple when they are naked, or their heads are made of earthenware, or that they are pumpkins or made of glass. Such people are insane. and I would be thought equally mad if I took anything from them as a model for myself. A brilliant piece of reasoning. As if I were not a man who sleeps at night and regularly has all the same experiences while asleep as madmen do when they are awake. Indeed, sometimes even more improbable ones. How often, asleep at night, am I convinced of just familiar events that I am in my dressing gown sitting by the fire, when in fact I'm lying undressed in bed? Yet at the moment my eyes are certainly wide awake when I look at this piece of paper. I shake my head and it's not asleep. As I stretch out and feel my hand, I do so deliberately, and I know what I'm doing. All this would not happen with such distinctness to someone asleep, indeed, as if I did not remember other occasions on which I have been tricked by exactly similar thoughts while asleep. As I think about this more carefully, I see plainly there are never any sure signs by means of which being awake can be distinguished from being asleep. The result is that I begin to feel dazed, and this very feeling only reinforces the notion that I may be asleep. Yes, how can I be sure that I'm not dreaming now? Why, that dream was so real. What did you dream? I dreamed that I was dreaming. So I may doubt that I'm awake. I may wonder if there's any distinction at all between what we call dreaming and what we call waking. And he continues, suppose that I'm dreaming and that these particulars, that my eyes are open, that I'm moving my head and stretching out my hands, are not true. Perhaps indeed, I do not even have such hands or a body at all. Nonetheless, it must surely be admitted that the visions which come in sleep are like paintings which must have been fashioned in the likeness of things that are real, and hence that at least these general kinds of things, eyes, head, hands, and body as a whole, are things which are not imaginary but are real and exist. Or even when painters try to create sirens and satyrs with the most extraordinary bodies, they cannot give them natures which are new in all respects. They simply jumble up limbs of different animals. So, I may be mistaken, but even if I am in this particular instance, that I don't have heads and hands, etc., there are heads and hands. I can just be engaged in a particular mistake. A satyr, by the way, mentions a satyr. That's another one of these crazy mythical beasts. This one was a composite of man and goat. And when artists put these things together, says Descartes, they don't ever think of anything new. Well, Descartes lived before Hollywood. But his general point is you can't counterfeit something unless there's something real to copy it from. Here's a guy by the name of Love 22. That's actually his name. He's changed it legally. And I don't know if he's still alive. It's been years since I've seen him, but I've seen him in Providence. I've seen him in Key West. He goes to Mardi Gras a lot. And he's a numerologist, mystical numerologist, and he believes that the number 22 has magical significance. And he sells $22 bills. They're, I think, 20 cents a piece, 6 for $1. Here, I have one here that I bought from, I think it's a little older edition than when you see here in series 1994, I think, and this is series 1982. But basically, you know, $22 bill. And the story is, he sold them in New Orleans. What's at Mardi Gras? A guy goes into 7-Eleven, buys a package of cigarettes with a $22 bill, gets some change. Later, the merchant looks at the $22 bill and calls the cops. They arrest Love 22 for counterfeiting, hauled before a judge, and he says to the judge, well, Your Honor, this is not a counterfeit $22 bill. This is a real $22 bill. Judge thinks about that for a minute and he says, you're absolutely right. Case dismissed. There ought to be a charge of criminal stupidity for somebody who would take a $22 bill, but you are not at fault. Yeah. So how can you counterfeit a $22 bill if there isn't a real one? You can counterfeit arms and heads and legs, etc. Or if perhaps, he goes on about artists, they managed to think up something so new that nothing remotely similar has ever been seen before, something which is therefore completely fictitious and unreal, alien maybe. At least the colors used in the composition must be real. By similar reasoning, though these general kinds of things, eyes, head, hands, and so on, could be imaginary, it must at least be admitted that certain other simpler and more universal things are real. These are, as it were, the real colors from which we form all the images of things, whether true or false, that occur in our thought. This class appears to include corporeal as bodily nature in general, and its extension, what we call three-dimensionality, the shape of extended things, the quantity or size and number of these things, the place in which they may exist, the time through which they may endure, and so on. So a reasonable conclusion from this might be that physics, astronomy, medicine, and all the other disciplines which depend on the study of composite things are doubtful, while arithmetic, geometry, and other subjects of this kind, which deal only with the simplest and most general things, regardless of whether they really exist in nature or not, contain something certain and indubitable. And here you've heard this idea before, haven't you? He doesn't use the terms analytic and synthetic, and he doesn't define them in quite the way that we do now, but that's kind of what he's getting at. There's something about mathematical propositions which are much, much solider than something about, let's say, astronomical propositions, medical propositions. 4, he says, whether I am awake or asleep, 2 and 3 added together are 5, and a square has no more than 4 sides. It seems impossible that such transparent truths should incur any suspicion of being false. And yet, firmly rooted in my mind is the long-standing opinion that there is an omnipotent God who made me the kind of creature that I am. How do I know that he has not brought it about that there is no earth, no sky, no extended thing, no shape, no size, no place, while at the same time ensuring that all these things appear to me to exist just as they do now? In other words, might there be an evil genius, an evil demon manipulating my perceptions, even of something like 2 + 3 = 5 behind the scenes? What is more, since I sometimes believe that others go astray in cases where they think they have the most perfect knowledge, may I not similarly go wrong every time I add 2 and 3 or count the sides of a square, or in some even simpler manner if that's imaginable? But perhaps God would not have allowed me to be deceived in that way, since he is said to be supremely good. But if it were inconsistent with his goodness to have created me such that I am deceived all the time, it would seem equally foreign to his goodness to allow me to be deceived even occasionally, yet this last assertion cannot be made. So not only might there be an evil genius, maybe God himself is that evil genius. Surely God wouldn't deceive me on a grand scale, but he lets me be deceived on a small scale, and that seems as incompatible with his goodness. Maybe there's something wrong even with my idea of God. Are God and the devil really on opposite teams? What are you going to get Mom for her birthday? I have no idea. Let's get her something together. Do they root for the same football team, perhaps? What do you see at the bottom? Is that good or evil? Perhaps there may be some who would prefer to deny the existence of so powerful a God rather than believe that everything else is uncertain. Let us not argue with them, but grant them that everything said about God is a fiction. According to their supposition, then, I have arrived in my present state by fate or chance or a continuous chain of events or by some other means. Yet, since deception and error seem to be imperfections, the less powerful they make my original cause, the more likely it is that I am so imperfect as to be deceived all the time. I have no answer to these arguments, but am finally compelled to admit that there is not one of my former beliefs about which a doubt may not properly be raised. And this is not a flippant or an ill-considered conclusion, but is based on powerful and well-thought-out reasons. So in future, I must withhold my assent from these former beliefs just as carefully as I would from obvious falsehoods, if I want to discover any certainty. But it is not enough merely to have noticed this. I must make an effort to remember it. My habitual opinions keep coming back, and despite my wishes, they capture my belief, which is, as it were, bound over to them as a result of long occupation in the law of custom. I shall never get out of the habit of confidently assenting to these opinions, so long as I suppose them to be what in fact they are, namely highly probable opinions which, despite the fact that they are in a sense doubtful, as has just been shown, is still much more reasonable to believe than to deny. In view of this, I think it will be a good plan to turn my will in completely the opposite direction and deceive myself by pretending for a time that these former opinions are utterly false and imaginary. I shall do so until the weight of preconceived opinion is counterbalanced and the distorting influence of habit no longer prevents my judgment from perceiving things correctly. In the meantime, I know that no danger or error will result from my plan, and that I cannot possibly go too far in my distrustful attitude. This is because the task now in hand does not involve action, but but merely the acquisition of knowledge. I will suppose, therefore, that not God, who is supremely good and the source of truth, but rather some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning, has employed all his energies in order to deceive me. I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely the delusions of dreams which he has devised to ensnare my judgment. I shall consider myself as not having hands or eyes or flesh or blood or senses, but as falsely believing that I have all these things. I shall stubbornly and firmly persist in this meditation, and even if it is not in my power to know any truth, I shall at least do what is in my power, that is, resolutely guard against ascending to any falsehoods, so that the deceiver, however powerful and cunning he may be, will be unable to impose on me in the slightest degree. But this is an arduous undertaking, and a kind of laziness brings me back to normal life. I'm like a prisoner who's enjoying an imaginary freedom while asleep, and as he begins to suspect that he is asleep, he dreads being woken up and goes along with the pleasant delusion as long as he can. In the same way, I happily slide back into my old opinions and dread being shaken out of them for fear that my peaceful sleep may be followed by hard labor when I wake, and then I shall have to toil not in the light, but amidst the inextricable darkness of the problems I have now raised. So Descartes wonders, maybe there's not a God, maybe there is an evil genius deceiving me, so I'm going to doubt everything. Now, that sounds a little impious, but Descartes remained within the church. In fact, he's buried in the church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. There's his tomb. You can visit it fairly easily. Although in the end, after his death, the Pope banned his books for a bit. Here is the Church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. By the way, just right across, if you look to the left-hand side of that big steeple there of the church, are two cafes, the Deux Magots and the Café de Flore. And Simone de Beauvoir frequented the Deux Magots, and Jean-Paul Sartre the Café de Flore. And the place there between the cafes and the church has in recent decades been named for them, the Place Sartre Beauvoir. Now, Rue Descartes, isn't it cool? You know, the Europeans generally, not just the French, name their streets and squares after philosophers. Wow. But old habits die hard, he says. I'm getting tired. It's nap time. So I'll see you mañana, and we'll start all over again. And I'll start anew. And he does. So the second meditation then. Next day he gets up and he starts thinking one more time. The nature of the human mind and how it is better known than the body. So serious are the doubts into which I have been thrown as a result of yesterday's meditation that I can neither put them out of my mind nor see any way of resolving them. It feels as if I have fallen unexpectedly into a deep whirlpool which tumbles me around so that I can neither stand at the bottom nor swim to the top. Nevertheless, I will make an effort and once more attempt the same path which I started on yesterday. Anything which admits of the slightest doubt, I will set aside just as if I had found it to be wholly false. And I will proceed in this way until I recognize something certain, or if nothing else, until I at least recognize for certain that there is no certainty. Archimedes used to demand just one firm and immovable point in order to shift the entire earth. So I too can hope for great things if I manage to find just one thing, however slight, that is certain and unshakable. So I want an Archimedean lever and I want a fulcrum. Archimedes said, just give me a long enough lever and a fulcrum in the right place and I can move anything. I will suppose then that everything I see is spurious. I will believe that my memory tells me lies and none of the things that it reports ever happened. I have no senses. Body, shape, extension, and movement and place are all chimeras. So what remains true? Perhaps just the one fact that nothing is certain. How do I know that I'm not very basically deceived at all turns? Philip Henry Goss, 19th century figure, a creationist who had trouble with fossils. But he said, well, maybe God created the world with fossils already in them as if they were real. And that's why we think that the Earth is really all that old. Bertie Russell parodied this in what he calls the 5-minute hypothesis. How would I know if it were true? How would I know whether or not I had sprung into existence 5 minutes ago with a whole fake memory of biographies planted in my head, and or maybe last Thursday? How would I know that's the case? Let's watch a short video on that subject.
Let's go to the thought bubble. Philosopher Bertrand Russell illustrated the concept of global doubt with this troubling thought. What if the universe was created just 5 minutes ago? In this scenario, known as the 5-minute hypothesis, the creator of the universe could have designed many elements of the world to make them appear pre-worn, so as to seem old. From dinosaur bones fashioned by the creator implanted for us to find, to that scar on your knee put there by the creator along with the preloaded false memory of how you got it. It seems crazy, but there's no way to prove that it isn't the case. The question for Russell was, does it matter? Philosophy.
Yes. Or there's the brain in a vat hypothesis of Hilary Putnam. How do you know that you're not a brain disembodied in a vat of liquid keeping you alive, and that what you experience is no different from what you might experience if you were a completely embodied being? But if they're exactly the same experiences and thoughts and so on and so forth, how do you know whether you are in fact embodied or a brain in a vat? Descartes lived way before virtual reality, but basically it's the same problem. You know, virtual reality can seem really real, even when you know it's not. So he says then this: I will suppose then that everything I see is spurious. I will believe that my memory tells me lies, and that none of these things that it reports have ever happened. All these things that I think that I know are chimeras, imaginary beasts. Yet, apart from everything I've just listed, how do I know that there is not something else which does not allow even the slightest occasion of doubt? Is there not a God, or whatever we may call him, who puts into me the thoughts I'm now having? But why do I think this, since I myself may perhaps be the author of these thoughts? In that case, am I not at least something? But I have just said that I have no senses and no body. This is the sticking point. What follows from this? Am I not so bound up with the body and with senses that I cannot exist without them? But I have convinced myself that there is absolutely nothing in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. Does it now follow that I too do not exist? No. If I convince myself of something, then I certainly existed. But there is a deceiver of supreme power and cunning who is deliberately and constantly deceiving me. In that case, too, I undoubtedly exist. If he is deceiving me, and let him deceive me as much as he can, he will never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I think that I am something. So, after considering everything very thoroughly, I must finally conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. This is, of course, the cogito. Professor Hook, do I exist? Who wants to know? If you can ask that question, you've already answered it. Even if the evil genius is deceiving me, it's still me he's deceiving. You know, there's somebody there being deceived. It's like there's somebody there doubting. That much you cannot doubt. But he continues. But I do not yet have a sufficient understanding of what this I is that now necessarily exists. So I must be on guard against carelessly taking something else to be this I, and so making a mistake in this very item of knowledge that I maintain is the most certain and evident of all. I will therefore go back and meditate on what I originally believed myself to be before I embarked on this present train of thought. I will then subtract everything capable of being weakened even minimally by the arguments now introduced, so that what is left at the end may be exactly and only what is certain and unshakable. What am I? He comes to conclude, I am a thinking thing. What then did I formerly think I was? A man. But what is a man? Shall I say a rational animal? No, for then I should have to inquire what an animal is, what rationality is. And in this way, one question would lead me down the slope to other harder ones, and I do not now have the time to waste on subtleties of this kind. He's making reference here to Aristotle. Aristotle, we've seen Aristotle before, he had some crazy ideas. The substance of most of them the substance has not stood the test of time, but here's one that has. Aristotle gave a famous definition of man. Man is two things: zoon politikon kai logon echon, the political animal and the animal which speaks. And even today, this is a durable definition. We are the only animal that generates language. That's not to say we're the only one that communicates, not to say we're the only one that vocalizes. Other species do that, but we generate language. We form sentences, propositions, which we've never heard before. We're not just imitating, we're capable of generating them. That's a very, very basic thing that distinguishes human beings. And Aristotle hit on that, and he was, he hit a run on that one. But Descartes says, I'm not going to follow Aristotle down this path. I'm going to, though, say this. I am a man, so let me look inside myself. The first thought, instead I propose to concentrate on what came into my thought spontaneously and quite naturally whenever I used to consider what I was. Well, the first thought to come to mind was that I had a face, hands, arms, the whole mechanical structure of limbs which can be seen in a corpse, and which I called the body. The next thought was that I was nourished, that I moved about, that I engaged in sense perception and thinking, and these actions I attributed to the soul. But as to the nature of this soul, either I did not think about this, or else I imagined it to be something tenuous, like a wind or a fire or ether which permeated my more solid parts. As to the body, however, I had no doubts about it, but thought I knew its nature distinctly. If I had tried to describe the mental conception I had of it, I would have expressed it as follows. By a body, I understand whatever has a determinable shape and definable location and can occupy a space in such a way as to exclude any other body. It can be perceived by touch, sight, hearing, taste, or smell, 5 senses. Can be moved in various ways, not by itself, but by whatever else comes into contact with it. For according to my judgment, the power of self-movement, like the power of sensation or thought, was quite foreign to the nature of a body. Indeed, it was a source of wonder to me that certain bodies were found to contain faculties of this kind. But what shall I now say that I am? When I am supposing that there is some supremely powerful, and if it's permissible to say so, malicious deceiver, who is deliberately trying to trick me in every way he can I now assert that I possess even the most insignificant of all the attributes which I have just said belong to the nature of a body? I scrutinize them, think about them, go over them again, but nothing suggests itself. It is tiresome and pointless to go through the list once more. But what about the attributes I assign to the soul? Nutrition or movement? Since I do not have a body, these are mere fabrications. Sense perception? This surely does not occur without a body. And besides, when asleep, I have appeared to perceive through the senses many things which I afterwards realized I did not perceive through the senses at all. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. Thinking, at last I have discovered it. Thought, this alone is inseparable from me. I am, I exist, that is certain. But for how long? For as long as I am thinking. For it could be that were I to totally cease from thinking, I should totally cease to exist. At present, I am not admitting anything except what is necessarily true. I am then, in the strict sense, only a thing that thinks. That is, I am a mind, or intelligence, or intellect, or reason, words whose meaning I have been ignorant of until now. But for all that, I am a thing which is real, which truly exists. But what kind of a thing? As I have just said, a thinking thing. So Aristotle would have said, man is a rational animal, etc. Descartes says, nope, I'm not going to worry about definitions, but I'm going to look at myself because I'm a man. And again, this is a notion he probably got from his Jesuit education. St. Ignatius taught his followers to do this every day. Descartes is not a Jesuit, but he, again, was schooled by them, seems to adopt that method. So what did I used to think of myself as? I was a body with all the attributes that you would see in a corpse, for example, a dead body. A living body has the same thing. It's a machine, basically. Also, I was a soul, which I thought of something tenuous, kind of airy-fairy, like a wind or a fire. And it was a source of wonder to me that these two things could even interact. if you've seen the film Ghost, you know what he's talking about here. Patrick Swayze gets murdered and he tries to contact his wife, now his widow. At first he's frustrated doing it. At first he's amazed at the things he can do. He can walk through walls. He doesn't have to stop and open a door. But if he tries to open a door, he is pure ghost and no physicality and cannot interact, cannot manage to turn that doorknob. So, as you know the story, he finds a medium. Whoopi Goldberg here plays the medium and manages to get in touch eventually with his wife. But how do mind and matter cooperate? The body seems so substantial. The soul, not so much. Yeah, the body is solid. The soul is airy-fairy. Gilbert Ryle used the metaphor of the ghost in the machine. In Descartes' view, our minds are ghosts in a machine, the soul in the mechanical body. And Descartes had a curious way of trying to reconcile these two. How could these two things be connected? He pinpointed the pineal gland, which is in the brain, and said that was the actual organ which allows the interconnection between body and soul. Of course, we now know nothing of the sort, but at least he was, maybe like the pre-Socratics, he was giving it a good guess. But what's characteristic of Descartes, and often remarked upon, it's called Cartesian dualism, is this distinction between the soul of the mind on the one hand, the body and the brain on the other. And a Cartesian dualist will make a distinction, we'll come back to that in a minute, between the mind and the brain. They don't think they're the same thing. So you've got the ghost and the machine, body and brain. Now, is there a distinction to be drawn between mind and brain? Well, Descartes would say that there is. If you're familiar with the enterprise known as artificial intelligence suspects that no, there's no distinction to be drawn there. It's a distinction without a difference, that the mind is actually just another word for brain. The brain is just a machine. It's a wet meat computer. Now, electronic computers, I can't show you my laptop here that I'm using, but you've all seen them. Just dry, non-organic, primitive brains. So says the artificial intelligence community. And their main hypothesis is it's just a matter of time before these dry brains start to think in the same way that the wet meat brains do. Well, that is an hypothesis. But is the brain a wet meat computer? It's still an hypothesis, and unvalidated hypothesis, put it that way, because nobody has yet built a machine that thinks. Nobody has yet built a mechanical, dry computer that thinks like a wet meat brain does. Now, maybe it'll be done. And if it happens to be done, we're going to make some headway in a big way on this old problem that goes back, through Descartes, back to Plato, as long as there's been philosophy. But for the time being, no, computers are not brains. They're actually really stupid. They have to be told every step of the way by programmers what to do, what to execute, et cetera, et cetera. Now, for the longest time, it took us a while to figure this out. And if you go back to science fiction, let's say this TV show from the 1960s, Lost in Space. It was a 1965 show set in 1997. And the ship's computer was this all-seeing brain. You could talk to it, it could talk back to you. It would think, danger, danger, Will Robinson, Dr. Smith is evil. That's Dr. Smith there. Of course, in 1997, we were still dealing with Windows 95, which wasn't anything like the computer in this spaceship. If you remember the old Star Trek, about the same period of time, the computer was a super brain. Lieutenant Uhura, she would talk to the computer, and it would talk back to her. You couldn't tell that it wasn't a human being. 2001, A Space Odyssey, 1968. And again, how they imagined the very near future, which is now our distant past or near past, is quite interesting. HAL 9000, the computer on board that ship, not only a super brain, he was an evil genius. Dave, I'm afraid I can't do that, Dave. He starts to shut down the life support systems before Dave manages to shut him down. And a lot of the early speculation about computers was really wildly off. What are they going to do? People were fearful of them. They're going to take over the world and so forth. But simultaneously with fear came fantasy about the magical transformations that computers are going to bring. Where are those flying cars from the Jetsons? Actually, the black and white cartoon there on the bottom is not terribly unlike what computers were at some point in the fairly recent past. But people invested wild hopes in it. Here, for example, 1969, if you had too much money and too little sense, Neiman Marcus would sell you the kitchen of the future. What was it? It's a computer dedicated to one and only one task: storing recipes and printing them out. Ooh, let's get a printout. That's only $10,000, which is in today's money, we're from $50,000 to $177,000. And then you've got this big hulking thing sitting there in your kitchen. And that's a pretty small kitchen. There's hardly enough room to move around. But that's an item which I'm sensitive to. I have a big thing about my kitchen. But there's no way in hell I want that in there, even if it gave me printed out recipes. Wow, no. And even if I had $10,000 in 1969, which my family didn't. I remember when I was an undergraduate, computer dating. And this was simultaneously fascinating and horrifying, because we were worried even back then about how computers would take over our lives. The IBM cards used to say, we use cards, by the way, punch cards, do not fold, spindle, or mutilate. And, we were afraid of being treated like bits of data. How's that working out? But basically, the computer will find a perfect date for you. I actually did this when this must have been about 1973, 74, when I was up at Florida State. And, I got matched with a number of women, and pretty much turned out the way dating had always turned out. Mixed results, but the computer wasn't any better at finding the girl of my dreams than I was on my own. And basically Gene Shalit does the article on this. They're all full of expectations, and of course they both lie in their questionnaires, and then plain Jane and so. And that's exactly what happens on Twitter and Tinder and Grindr and all that kind of stuff today. Match.com, Facebook, whatever. Online, that's what they look like, and in person, that's what they look like. So, in fact, as we've gotten to know them better, computers, we find, are still extraordinarily stupid. There's a key book by Hubert Dreyfus, What Computers Can't Do. It's now in the second edition, What Computers Still Can't Do. And back in the days when you had to know programming in order to use a computer, by the way, there was a whole bunch of to do about getting computer literacy, and nowadays we all use computers all the time, and most of us are not at all literate in the programming languages and the technical stuff. But in those days you had to be, and there was a phrase back then that summed it up for people trying to program: GIGO. And GIGO stands for garbage in, garbage out. That is, if you don't tell a computer explicitly what you want it to do in so many words and so many steps, that it's going to either stop, or it's going to give you a completely incompatible result. And even today, if we try to get computers to translate languages, for example, they don't catch nuance, they don't catch subtlety. Off-the-shelf language translation, and now for a long time, I used to have software on my hard drive to do this. Now, of course, if you know this, you can go to Google Translate. It's less than 100%. Let me put it that way. The few languages that I know, when I try to get a result just to test it, I may get inconsistent results. I won't get 100%. But an ordinary, competent human translator is going to give you 100% or pretty close. A couple stories. Early 1960s, MIT, which was one of the big tech universities, had a big mainframe computer, one of these huge things, and they programmed it to translate between Russian and English. So they gave it this sentence from scripture: the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And the Russian translation came back as, the vodka is good, but the meat is bad. Well, spirit, vodka is a spirit, flesh, meat, but obviously that's not what the biblical passage meant. The computer couldn't sort that. there was a story also trying to translate it to Chinese. Out of sight, out of mind, it comes back as invisible idiot. Well, that's a literal translation, I guess, but it misses the point. And again, computers don't get that kind of, which even a small, even a child, let's put that, maybe not a small child, even a child could understand, that that's a metaphor. Actually, we've known since about 1950 what it would be like if machines could think. Alan Turing, it's an unfortunate story there. He was gay and was persecuted and committed suicide. The British government recently has formally given an apology to him. If you've seen the film The Imitation Game, he was involved in cracking the Enigma code, the German secret code in World War II. Widely considered the father of artificial intelligence, and he devised what's known as a Turing test. And the Turing test is this. If a human, represented here by C, could interact with a computer represented by A using ordinary language and still not be able to tell that it was not interacting with a human, such as B, then the computer in question would be intelligent, would have passed the Turing test. However, let me stress, this has not happened. We don't have a computer yet that you can communicate with and not know it's a computer. If and when we get to that point, though, if and when the threshold of the Turing test is crossed, then we have created a mechanical brain. Then we've shown that the dry electronic brain is the same basically as a wet meat brain, and then it's just all uphill from there. We might want to do some tinkering and, get the machine to learn, all that kind of stuff. We're not there. So, and on the Turing test, you get extra credit if you can convince the examiner that he's a computer. It's also possible to fail the Turing test. Boss says to Dilbert, get us some risk management software. What can risk management software tell you that my common sense and experience can't? Data. Stop failing the Turing test. Yeah, it's possible for humans not to pass. Even when machines begin to think, then we're going to know that Descartes was mistaken and that mind is just another word for brain, contrary to what he says. But we're not there yet. The jury is still out. Okay. Even when I have what I think of as a sense experience, the I who is having the experience is my mind. Okay. But for all that, I'm a thing which is real, which truly exists. But what kind of thing? As I've just said, a thinking thing. We're on page 500 now, the first new paragraph in the second column. He continues. What else am I? I'll use my imagination. I am not that structure of limbs which is called a human body. I am not even some thin vapor which permeates the limbs, the wind, fire, air, breath, or whatever I depict in my imagination. For these are things which I suppose to be nothing. Let this supposition stand. For all that, I am still something. And yet, may it not perhaps be the case that these very things which I'm supposing to be nothing, because they are unknown to me, are in reality identical with the I of which I am aware? I do not know. And for the moment, I shall not argue the point, since I can make judgments only about things which are known to me. I know that I exist. The question is, what is this I that I know? If the I is understood strictly as we've been taking it, then it is quite certain that knowledge of it does not depend on things of whose existence I am as yet unaware. So it cannot depend on any of the things which I invent in my imagination. And the very word invent shows me my mistake. It would indeed be a case of fictitious invention if I used my imagination to establish that I was something or other, for imagining is simply contemplating the shape or image of a corporeal thing. Yet now I know for certain both that I exist and at the same time that all such images and in general everything related to the nature of the body could be mere dreams and chimeras. Once this point has been grasped, to say, I will use my imagination to get to know more distinctly what I am, would seem to be as silly as saying, I am now awake and see some truth, but since my vision is not yet clear enough, I will deliberately fall asleep so that my dreams may provide a truer and clearer representation. I thus realize that none of the things that the imagination enables me to grasp is at all relevant to this knowledge of myself which I possess, and that the mind must therefore be most carefully diverted from such things if it is to perceive its own nature as distinctly as possible. But what then am I? A thing that thinks. What is that? A thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, is willing as unwilling, also imagines and has sensory perceptions. So we come back to this. This is going to be interesting. This is a considerable list. If everything on it belongs to me, but does it? Is it not one and the same I who is now doubting almost everything, who nevertheless understands some things, who affirms that this one thing is true, denies everything else, desires to know more, is unwilling to be deceived, imagines many things even involuntarily, and is aware of many things which apparently come from the senses? Are not all these things just as true as the fact that I exist, even if I'm asleep all the time, and even if he who created me is doing all he can to deceive me? Which of all these activities is distinct from my thinking? Which of them can be said to be separate from myself? The fact that it is I who am doubting and understanding and willing is so evident that I see no way of making it any clearer. But it is also the case that the I who imagines is the same I. For even if, as I suppose, none of the objects of imagination are real, the power of imagination is something which really exists and is part of my thinking. Lastly, it is also the same I who has sensory perceptions or is aware of bodily things as it were through the senses. For example, I am now seeing light, hearing a noise, feeling heat. But I'm asleep, so all this is false. Yet I certainly seem to be, to hear, and to be warmed. This cannot be false. What is called having a sensory perception is strictly this, and in this restricted sense of the term, it is simply thinking. Okay? We talked about rationalism and empiricism before, and I cautioned you, be careful. If you're trying to define rationalism, the opposite of rationalism is not insanity. If you're trying to define empiricism, the opposite of empiricism is not woolly-mindedness. And here's a very good example of why that caution is important. Do we have sense experiences? Yes, says Descartes, we do have sense experiences, but those are themselves mental events. We have these experiences, but we may mistake what they're about. What we can be sure is that they are experiences, they are things that go on as part of our thinking. What's not at all clear is because we may assume that there are senses which give us these experiences, that's in fact where we get these experiences. So Descartes is not denying that we have sense experiences, he's just characterizing them in a very peculiar way, a very precise but very peculiar way. And by the same token, on the flip side, somebody like Locke does not deny that we have ideas. Yes, we have ideas. It's just that the ideas come to us first and foremost through the senses, nothing in the mind which is not first in the senses. So it's not that, if you take an empiricist point of view, you deny that we have any rationality at all. No, you're trying to characterize the nature of that rationality in a precise, if also peculiar way, and so too for Descartes. And now he's going to come to a very famous example, the analogy of the wax. Let's go on. We're at page 501, the first new paragraph in the second column. From all this, I am beginning to have a rather better understanding of what I am. But it still appears, and I cannot stop thinking this, that the corporeal things of which images are formed in my thought and which the senses investigate are known with much more distinctness than this puzzling I, which cannot be pictured in the imagination. And yet it is surely surprising that I should have a more distinct grasp of things which I realize are doubtful, unknown, and foreign to me than I have of that which is true and known, my own self. But I see what it is. My mind enjoys wandering off and will not yet submit to being restrained within the bounds of truth. Very well then. Just this once, let us give it a completely free rein so that after a while, when it is time to tighten the reins, it may more readily submit to being curbed. Let us consider the things which people commonly think they understand most distinctly of all. That is, the bodies which we touch and see. I do not mean bodies in general, where general perceptions are apt to be somewhat more confused, but one particular body. Let us take, for example, this piece of wax. Use Descartes' wax analogy. It has just been taken from the honeycomb. It has not quite lost the taste of the honey. It retains some of the scent of the flowers from which it was gathered. Its color, shape, and size are plain to see. It is hard, cold, and can be handled without difficulty. If you rap it with your knuckle, it makes a sound. In short, it is everything which appears necessary to enable a body to be known as distinctly as possible. But even as I speak, I put the wax by the fire, and look, the residual taste is eliminated, the smell goes away, the color changes, the shape is lost, the size increases, it becomes a liquid and hot, you can hardly touch it, and if you strike it, it no longer makes a sound. But does the same wax remain? It must be admitted that it does. No one denies it, no one thinks otherwise. So what was it in the wax that I understood with such distinctness? Evidently, one of the features which I arrived at by means of the senses for whatever came under taste, smell, sight, touch, or hearing has now altered, and yet the wax remains. Perhaps the answer lies in the thought which now comes to mind, namely, the wax was not, after all, the sweetness of the honey or the fragrance of the flowers or the whiteness or the shape or sound, but was rather a body which presented itself to me in these various forms a little while ago, but which now exhibits different ones. But what exactly is it that I'm now imagining? Let us concentrate. Take away everything which does not belong to the wax and see what is left. Merely something extended, flexible, and changeable. But what is meant here by flexible and changeable? Is it what I picture in my imagination, that this piece of wax is capable of changing from a round shape to a square shape, or from a square shape to a triangular shape? Not at all. For I can grasp that the wax is capable of countless changes of this kind, yet I am unable to run through the immeasurable number of changes in my imagination, from which it follows that it is not the faculty of imagination which gives me my grasp of the wax as flexible and changeable. And what is meant by extended, three-dimensional in other words, is the extension of the wax also unknown? For it increases if the wax melts, increases again if it boils, and is greater still if the heat is increased. I would not be making a correct judgment about the nature of the wax unless I believed it capable of being extended in many more different ways than I will ever encompass in my imagination. I must therefore admit that the nature of this piece of wax is in no way revealed by my imagination, but is perceived by the mind alone. I'm speaking of this particular piece of wax. The point is even clearer with regard to wax in general. But what is this wax which is perceived by the mind alone? It is, of course, the same wax which I see, which I touch, which I picture in my imagination. In short, the same wax which I thought it to be from the start. And yet, and here's the point, the perception I have of it is a case not of vision or touch or imagination, nor has it ever been, despite previous appearances, but of purely mental scrutiny. And this can be imperfect and confused as it was before, or clear and distinct as it is now, depending on how carefully I concentrate on what the wax consists in. Okay, Descartes' wax. No, it's not bikini wax. It's beeswax. Look at the wax bunny here. At first, it's hard. It makes a noise when you wrap it on the table. It's solid, has its own shape, and it has a low volume. If you ever made a candle, you pour, liquid wax into a candle mold, put the wick in, you let it cool. What happens is you get this concavity as it cools. The wax was level when it was hot, and then as it cools, it loses volume. But if I heat it again, the wax bunny is going to get soft and eventually going to melt into a liquid. What's a liquid? A liquid is something which takes the shape of whatever container into which it flows, whereas a solid is something that has its own shape. And then when I heat it, it has a higher volume than it did before. But it's the exact same wax. Now here's the problem. He just uses two examples. He says there are an infinite number of states in which this wax can be imagined if I wanted to do that. State A, it's cool, solid, shaped, scented, low volume. State B, it's hot, fluid, shapeless, unscented, and high volume. Two very different sets of perceptual descriptors, but they describe the same wax. How is this possible? It follows that if I grasp the wax, it's not because of any of the sense properties, but it's because I have the concept of waxness. That's how I know the wax. It's, what does he put it, perceived by my mind alone, purely a mental event. My sense percepts, such as I call them, give me the merely variable aspects of the wax, but if I want to understand the essence of the wax, it's my intellect alone that gives me that. So the waxness of the idea is the idea of wax, not the sensory physical wax. Okay, but as I reach this conclusion, I'm amazed at how weak and prone to error my mind is. For although I am thinking about these matters within myself silently without speaking, nonetheless, the actual words bring me up short. And I'm almost tricked by ordinary ways of talking. We say that we see the wax itself if it is there before us, not that we judge it to be there from its color or shape. And this might lead me to conclude without more ado that knowledge of the wax comes from what the eye sees and not from the scrutiny of the mind alone. But then if I look out the window and see men crossing the square, as I happen to have done, I normally say that I see the men themselves, just as I say that I see the wax. Yet, do I see any more than hats and coats that could conceal automatons? I judge that they are men, and so something which I thought I was seeing with my eyes is in fact grasped solely by the faculty of judgment, which is in my mind. Okay, automatons. Let's stop and chase a little shaggy dog story here for a minute. This is the Deutsches Museum in Munich, where I used to live. I grew up as a boy. It was at the time the world's largest technological museum. I'm not sure it's not advertised as that now. It's still pretty large. And there's all kinds of cool things. You know, we used to take field trips there from elementary school, and there's actually a complete reproduction of the Altamira cave in Spain, one of the earliest caves with paintings in it. There is a German World War I submarine, which they got to keep. You know, the Allies were destroying all the former German submarines because submarines were pretty powerful weapons, but they agreed to cut it out and make it, you know, unfloatable and use it as an exhibit. And so they were allowed to do that. So you can walk, they can't actually walk through it, but you can walk up to and look into one of the famous U-boat from World War I, and all kinds of airplanes, and, you know, V1 and V2 rockets from the Second World War, all kinds of, you know, so still, I like to go there. But last time I was there, I saw myself in this museum. I had become a museum piece because there was a new exhibit on the history of computing and other mechanical sorts of devices. And in the museum display, I saw these things. A punch card reader. Remember, I talked about punch cards a minute ago. A line printer, a tape storage drive, an input terminal. All this equipment was stuff that I used when I was in graduate school. I remember when I was an undergraduate sophomore year, I foolishly turned down the opportunity of a lifetime. I could have learned punch card operation. I could have learned how to punch computer cards, because computers, you know, are the wave of the future, and you need to be computer literate. And I just said, no, I have other things to do, and I turned the opportunity down. Dumb kid, right? Well, we were still using punch cards early on when I got to graduate school, but shortly thereafter they got phased out. They go, we don't need them anymore. So much of this technology has changed so rapidly that, you know, within one person's lifetime, I'm not that old, in one person's lifetime, this stuff can become museum pieces. You know, look at the tape drive there. We don't do that anymore. We have hard drives. We have all kinds of, you know, cloud storage. But I should probably drag it out. But over there in my attic, I have one of these big tapes, which I used when I was in graduate school. When I left, they gave it to me. I have no machine that can read it anymore, but that was how we stored stuff. You know, that was how you took your property away with you. So by the summer of 2010, I find that I am a museum piece. Now, this was a word processor that I used in graduate school. Wrote my first published article on this, wrote my dissertation on this. Let me tell you, the worst word processor is better than the best typewriter. And over here on the left is what was the best typewriter at the time, the IBM Selectric with the bouncing ball. We used to bribe the secretaries to give us the key on the weekend so we could come in there and, you know, type our papers on the state-of-the-art machines. They locked the balls away for the weekend, but they, you know, you'd be bribed to give you the key. But this here, this monitor, big black and white image there in most of the slide, it has a keyboard. Where's the monitor? Where's the screen? There is none. So you can't see what you're doing. No WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. Nope. And where's the mouse? No mouse. No graphical user interface, GUI. What you would do is you would take, and usually write it out in longhand. I take my, you know, 8.5 by 14 sheet, and I would get on the system, and this was just a terminal connected to the mainframe way across campus. TTY system A, and it'll come back and say, yep, go. Mount my tape number such and such. okay, just a minute. And somebody way across campus would take that big old tape, put it out, okay, now you can go. And then I would type in maybe 20 lines of text. Now, I didn't see this as I was typing it in, but if I wanted to see it, I'd have to say, okay, TTY, print out lines 1 through 20. And then right in front of me on that printer with the paper you see right there, then it would print what I just typed in. Now I could see it, but I couldn't see it like I do now in a word processor, right in front of me as I was typing, make corrections, whatever. It was really awkward. This is about the worst word processor ever devised, but it was still better than the best typewriter. Shortly thereafter, we got this kind of thing. We got monitors, WYSIWYG, GUI, graphical user interface, etc. And so to that extent, we no longer need to be computer literate. We don't have to know how these things work any more than we know how to fix a streetcar or a 747, if we fly. We don't need the basic knowledge of how it works in order to use it. Computing has become like that. But it was a very cumbersome process, okay? So in this exhibit, there were also some automatons. These are early modern figures. The mechanical Turk, he was quite a sight to see. He would move his head and his arms, and of course they've uncovered his workings in his chest, but he had this tunic, over the front, looked like a person. The preacher on the right-hand side would, preach and raise his hands and do benedictions and so on and so forth. And this is the kind of machine that Descartes was talking about when he talks about an automaton here in this passage. How do I know when I look down, let's say, look out my window and I see all these umbrellas? I say, oh, there are people walking around with the umbrellas, but I don't actually see the people. How do I know that these are not automatons, robots, walking around under the umbrellas? I don't, but I make the inference because it's a reasonable one and, pretty much it works. That's what's going on there. In fact, people there. Descartes doesn't use umbrellas. He uses the notion of rain hats and cloaks, but I look down and I see the rain hats. How do I know what's under the rain hat? Could be a dog, could be the preacher, could be that automaton. But I know now, he says, that even bodies that are not strictly perceived by the senses or the faculty of imagination, but by the intellect alone, and that this perception derives not from the being touched or seen, but from their being understood. Let's see. Sorry, where we were there. Sorry, I lost my place. Oh, here, right. Sorry. Page 502, we're going to start with the first new paragraph in the second column. The last part of the last paragraph, something which I thought was seen with my eyes is in fact grasped solely by the faculty of judgment, which is in my mind. However, one who wants to achieve knowledge above the ordinary level should feel ashamed at having taken ordinary ways of talking as the basis for doubt. So let us proceed and consider on which occasions my perception of the nature of the wax was more perfect and evident. Was it when I first looked at it and believed I knew it by my external senses, or at least by what they call the common sense, that is the power of imagination? Or is my knowledge more perfect now, after a more careful investigation of the nature of the wax and of the means by which it is known? Any doubt on this issue would clearly be foolish, for what distinctness was there in my earlier perception? Was there anything in it which an animal could not possess? But when I distinguish the wax from its outward forms, take the clothes off, as it were, and consider it naked, then, although my judgment may still contain errors, at least my perception now requires a human mind. But what am I to say about this mind or about myself? So far, remember, I'm not admitting there's anything else in me except a mind. What I ask is this I, which seems to perceive the wax so distinctly. Surely my awareness of my own self is not merely much truer and more certain than my awareness of the wax, but also much more distinct and evident. For if I judge that the wax exists from the fact that I see it, clearly this same fact entails much more evidently that I myself also exist. It is possible that what I see is not really the wax. It is possible that I do not even have eyes with which to see anything. But when I see, or think I see, I'm not here distinguishing the two, it is simply not possible that I, who am now thinking, am not something. By the same token, If I judge that the wax exists from the fact that I touch it, the same result follows, namely that I exist. If I judge that it exists from the fact that I imagine it, or for any other reason, exactly the same thing follows. And the result that I have grasped in the case of the wax may be applied to everything else located outside me. Moreover, if my perception of the wax seemed more distinct after it was established not just by sight or touch, but by many other considerations, it must be admitted that I now know myself even more distinctly. This is because every consideration whatsoever which contributes to my perception of the wax or of any other body cannot but establish even more effectively the nature of my own mind. But besides this, there is so much else in the mind itself which can serve to make my knowledge of it more distinct that it scarcely seems worth going through the contributions made by considering bodily things. I see that without any effort, I have now finally got back to where I wanted. I now know that even bodies are not strictly perceived by the senses or by the faculty of imagination, but by the intellect alone. And that this perception derives not from their being touched or seen, but from their being understood. And in view of this, I know plainly that I can achieve an easier and more evident perception of my own mind than of anything else. But since the habit of holding on to old opinions cannot be set aside so quickly, I should like to stop here and meditate for some time on this new knowledge I have gained so as to fix it more deeply in my own memory. All this thinking tires me out. Consciousness is that annoying time between naps, as Kitty says. Well, so far, what's he done? He's gotten to establish his own existence, but he's done so at the price of excluding the rest of the world, other objects, other persons. All he knows at this point in the second meditation is still that he exists, although he thinks he knows that as clearly and distinctly as it is possible to know anything. Descartes' girlfriend may have said, "Cogito ergo sum is all very well for you, but what about for me?" Who wants to know? Okay, so he goes, takes a nap, wakes up the next day. Now he's ready for the third meditation. The third meditation, look at the title of it. The existence of God. Okay, so far he's talked about the things that I can doubt, meditation 1. Meditation 2, how I can know the soul much more readily than I can know the body. Okay, he's been through that. And now the existence of God. Why God? Why drag God into it at this point? Well, not for theological reasons. Descartes is no more a priest than he is a candle maker when he talks about the wax, nor was Heraclitus interested in rivers primarily. There are philosophers, as we know, who have a theological bent, and all the saints among them, St. Anselm, St. Thomas, etc. And as we'll see, Berkeley also in a minute. But Descartes isn't interested in proving the existence of God for its own sake any more than he's interested in wax for its own sake. Oops. For that matter, not all those who try to prove God do so for purely metaphysical reasons. Some have quite pragmatic concerns. Pascal, we haven't talked about him yet. Pascal, also buried in a church, actually around the corner from the hotel where I spent my honeymoon. Pascal's wager, okay? He says, does God exist or does he not exist? It's a safer bet to believe that God exists than that he doesn't exist. Why? Okay, so supposing there's no God. You believe in him, you don't believe in him, it doesn't matter. Supposing there is a God. If you don't believe in him, you get punished. So belief in God is the better wager, since either nothing happens to you or you're rewarded, but at least you're not punished. And you can put that into a Punnett square in a payoff matrix like this. Maybe you'll get nothing in either case, but at least if you believe, you might get heaven, whereas if you don't believe, you might get hell. So it's a better bet. Some might say this is really not an argument for God, at least not in the same way that Aquinas and Anselm argue. Maybe it's not even theology. Maybe it's just prudence, and maybe that's something different. Bishop Berkeley also wrote in the wake of Descartes. And for Berkeley, God plays a particular role in the system of the universe. He is the keystone in a metaphysics that Berkeley wants to sustain. Berkeley's famous line, essayist for Kippy, to be is to be perceived. And of course, following Descartes, who put subjective perception at the center of philosophy, Berkeley says, how can we know that there is an external world? Well, to be is to be perceived. There's a very close relationship between perception and existence. So here's the problem. I can see everything around me when I'm awake. What happens when I go to sleep? Does it disappear? Do things just cease to exist if I am no longer conscious of them, if they're no longer being perceived? In developmental psychology, those of you who've taken child development know this, there's an age before which a child doesn't realize that if you take an object away, that the object still exists, it's just not there, or it's been covered over. So you take a favorite toy, for example, and you hide it, and the child thinks it's gone, and then is really surprised to see it again, because he thought it had gone away. This is called object permanence, okay? The question is, do objects have permanence if they are no longer perceived? So sometimes guys even learn object permanence, a new developmental milestone. But it was a problem for Berkeley. If in fact essayist Percipi, then would the universe be destroyed if we all fell asleep? And Berkeley's solution to that is no, because there's God, who neither slumbers nor sleeps. God is always perceiving. Therefore, things always continue to exist because there is a perceiver perceiving them. Ronnie Knox, Monsignor Ronnie Knox, who was a clergyman, wrote a limerick to illustrate this. He was up at Balliol. There's the quad in Balliol. There was a young man who said, God must find it exceedingly odd to think that the tree should continue to be when there's no one about in the quad. To which the reply was, Dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I am always about in the quad, and that's why the tree will continue to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. So, for Berkeley, God has a function as a metaphysical seatbelt. He is the guarantor of stability and continuity. As long as he's always watching, then things are, because essayist Percipi. Descartes likewise is interested in a kind of metaphysical seatbelt. He's not interested in theology per se, but God is going to do something useful for his system. That's why third meditation concerns the existence of God. Beware, though, and I said this before, so at the risk of being repetitious, any particular idea of God is not every idea of God. When we use the word God, it's ambiguous. That is, it covers legitimately multiple meanings. And this can, of course, sometimes involve a fallacy. To some people, the idea of God seems simple. To Descartes, it seems simple, as we'll see. But it's not simple. It's quite complex. His argument, though, depends on this not being the case. It depends on God being a simple, straightforward notion. But there's, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, who looks out for them in particular against the other nations, Hakuim. There's Allah, who looks after his faithful. There's Aristotle's God, the prime mover. There's God who created the universe, but he might not be in charge anymore. He might have wound it up like a watch and walked away and let it run down. There's the triune God of the Christians, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Not always the same thing. Yahweh was a tribal God. He was the war leader of the Israelite Confederacy, his chosen people. He was nationalistic. He gave his people victory in battle over their enemies. I guess he wasn't equally concerned with the enemy peoples. And yet Yahweh at the same time had Satan smite his friend Job just to test him, just to see if, he would curse God. And he sent his tribe into exile in Babylon, the Babylonian captivity, as Tanakh also tells us. This tradition of Yahweh that later became a universal God, what does St. Paul say? This is kind of echoing what Plato said in Meno, if you recall that. There's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. So God becomes the God who was a tribal God, becomes the God of all people universally. That's a changed idea. Even within a single religious tradition, that's not a simple idea. It undergoes development, it gets complex. And of course, there are other ideas besides Yahweh. You can read this, you can pause this and read it at your leisure. All these ideas of God are not the same idea. So now I seem to be able to lay it down as a general rule that whatever I perceive very clearly and distinctly is true. Let's go there. I will now shut my eyes, stop my ears, and withdraw all my senses. I will eliminate from my thoughts all images of bodily things, or rather, since this is hardly possible, I will regard all such images as vacuous, false, and worthless. I will converse with myself and scrutinize myself more deeply. It's Jesuit self-examination. And in this way, I will attempt to achieve, little by little, a more intimate knowledge of myself. I am a thing that thinks, that is, a thing that doubts, affirms, denies, understands a few things, is ignorant of many things, is willing, is unwilling, and also which imagines and has sensory perceptions. For, as I've noted before, even though the objects of my sensory experience and imagination may have no existence outside me, nevertheless, the modes of thinking which I refer to as cases of sensory perception and imagination, insofar as they are simply modes of thinking, do exist within me. Of that I am certain. In this brief list, I've gone through everything I truly know, or at least everything I have so far discovered that I know. Now I will cast around more carefully to see whether there may be other things within me which I have not yet noticed. I am certain that I am a thinking thing. Do I not therefore also know what is required for my being certain about anything? In this first item of knowledge, there is simply a clear and distinct perception of what I am asserting. This would not be enough to make me certain of the truth of the matter if it could ever turn out that something which I perceived with such clarity and distinctness was false. So, here it is. Now I seem to be able to lay it down as a general rule that whatever I perceive very clearly and distinctly is true. Okay, so now he's reached kind of a milestone for him. He is embracing what we can call a coherence theory of truth. There is in philosophy a discussion of what we can call truth tests, theories of truth, but it also extends beyond philosophy as well. The two major contenders in philosophy are what's called the correspondence theory of truth and the coherence theory of truth. There's also what William James called the pragmatic theory of truth. Truth is something that happens to an idea. An idea is true if it works, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. The correspondence theory of truth is also probably what the average man on the street holds to. The content of a proposition corresponds to the facts of the matter, and therefore if it does that, it's true. If it fails to do that, it's false. This is the standard account we have in journalism, at least we've had in journalism since the 20th century, the notion of objective reporting, nonpartisan, so forth. That wasn't always the idea in journalism, but it has been for quite some time. It's the standard scientific theory. You know, we say something is true if it corresponds to the facts of the matter. If it fails to correspond, we say it's false. Whereas in the coherence theory of truth, the content of a proposition either coheres with prior knowledge or is self-evident, and that's what makes it true. Descartes' clear and distinct ideas are an example of that. Or what Karl Popper calls the myth of the framework. Ideas are judged to be true if they fit a system of thought, if they cohere. So, you know, for example, in certain interpretations of Marxism, if a proposition coheres with the party line, then it's true, and if it fails to, that's false. You can, you know, sort out truth and falsity by comparison to sort of orthodoxy. But not everyone follows philosophy. We talked about the way in which you can have non-philosophical theories of ethics that may or may not map onto the philosopher's accounts of ethics, and talked about altruism in that respect particularly. It's also true of truth tests. For some people, truth is what makes me feel good. You know, where does Fox News come from? You know, what's true is what reflects me back to myself. The phenomena in social media called siloization. It's not just limited to social media, but people, you know, they want to hear, and you can target people with messages. If you know what their predilections are already, you can target them with messages that cater to those predilections, and you'll get your message accepted. Advertisers do this, political parties do this, you know, all the time through social media. In ancient Egypt, truth was whatever made the pharaoh look good. Okay, so you'll see, for example, the pharaoh is depicted in pictures as being 3 times as tall as his soldiers. Well, were the pharaohs giants? No, we have their mummies. We know they weren't. They were the same size as everybody else. But magnifying the pharaoh symbolically magnifies his glory, and that makes it true. A pharaoh will be credited with a victory over a particular general, and it turns out that his grandfather had also been credited with a victory over that same general. Well, the grandfather did win the victory, but even though the grandson didn't, it makes him look better if you attribute this victory to him. So it's true. That's, to us, is kind of a weird way, whatever makes the boss look good is what's true. Kind of weird, but it's a possible truth test. Truth is whatever serves the party. Pravda. If it comes from the head of state, it's true. Cluster Fox News. There's a spousal theory of truth. If I can suspect my spouse of cheating, then they must be doing it. Right? How many times does that go on? Well, Saul Bellow has an interesting dialogue in one of his novels, Herzog. People argue back and forth. One person says, "You think a fact is what's nasty. Facts are nasty. Yeah, you think they're true because they're nasty." And there's a kind of nastiness, truth test there too. So there are lots of ways in which people can sort out what they think to be true from what they think to be false. But the two kinds of ways that philosophers usually use are the correspondence and the coherence. Descartes, in this case, it gives us an example of the coherence approach. If I find a clear and distinct idea, that's got to be true. Whatever coheres with clear and distinct ideas counts as truth. So what sorts of things do? Well, let's go on, see what he says. "Yet I previously accepted as wholly certain and evident many things which I afterwards realized were doubtful. What were these? The earth, sky, stars, and everything else that I apprehended with my senses. But what was it about them that I perceived clearly? Just that the ideas or thoughts of such things appeared before my mind. Yet even now, I am not denying that these ideas occur within me, but there was, there was something else which I used to assert, and which through habitual belief I thought I perceived clearly, although I did not in fact do so. This is that there were things outside me which were the sources of my ideas and which resembled them in all respects. Here was my mistake, or at any rate, if my judgment was true, it was not thanks to the strength of my perception. But what about when I was considering something very simple and straightforward in arithmetic or geometry, for example, that 2 and 3 added together make 5 and so on? Did I not see at least these things clearly enough to affirm their truth? Analytic propositions, as we would now call them. Indeed, the only reason for my later judgment that they were open to doubt was that it occurred to me that perhaps some God could have given me a nature such that I was deceived even in matters which seemed most evident. And whenever my preconceived belief in the supreme power of God comes to mind, I cannot but admit that it would be easy for him, if he so desired, to bring it about that I go wrong even in those matters in which I think I see utterly clearly with my mind's eye. Yet, when I turn to the things themselves, which I think I perceive very clearly, I am so convinced by them that I spontaneously declare, let whoever can do so deceive me. He will never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I continue to think I am something, or make it true at some future time that I have never existed, since it is now true that I exist. Or bring it about that 2 and 3 added together are more or less than 5, or anything of this kind in which I see a manifest contradiction. And since I have no cause to think that there is a deceiving God, and I do not yet even know for sure whether there is a God at all, any reason for doubt which depends simply on this supposition is a very slight and, so to speak, metaphysical one. But in order to remove even this slight reason for doubt, as soon as the opportunity arises, I must examine whether there is a God, and if there is, whether he can be a deceiver. For if I do not know this, it seems that I can never be quite certain about anything else. First, however, considerations of order appear to dictate that I now classify my thoughts into definite kinds and ask which of them can properly be said to be the bearers of truth and falsity. Some of my thoughts are, as it were, images of things, and it is, and it is only in these cases that the term idea is strictly appropriate. For example, when I think of a man or a chimera or the sky or an angel or God. Other thoughts have various additional forms. Thus, when I will, or I'm afraid, or affirm or deny, there is always a particular thing which I take as the object of my thought, but my thought includes something more than the likeness of that thing. Some thoughts in this category are called volitions or emotions, while others are called judgments. Now, so far as ideas are concerned, provided they are considered solely in themselves, and I do not refer them to anything else, they cannot, strictly speaking, be false. For whether it is a goat or a chimera or I'm imagining, it is just as true that I imagine the former as the latter. As for the will and emotions, here too one need not worry about falsity, for even if the things which I may desire are wicked or even non-existent, that does not make it any less true that I desire them. Thus, the only remaining thoughts where I must be on my guard against making a mistake are judgments. And the chief and most common mistake which is to be found here consists in my judging that the ideas which are in me resemble or conform to things located outside me. Of course, if I consider just the ideas themselves simply as modes of my thought without referring to anything else, they could scarcely give me any material for error. Among my ideas, some appear to be innate, some to be adventitious, they just kind of happen, and others to have been invented by me. My understanding of what a thing is, what truth is, and what thought is seem to derive simply from my own nature. But my hearing a noise, as I do now, or seeing the sun or feeling the fire, comes from things which are located outside me, or so I have hitherto judged. Lastly, sirens, hippogriffs, and the like are my own invention. But perhaps all my ideas may be thought of as adventitious, or they may all be innate, or all made up, for as yet I have not clearly perceived their true origin. But the chief question at this point concerns the ideas which I take to be derived from things existing outside me. What is my reason for thinking that they resemble these things? Nature has apparently taught me to think this. But in addition, I know by experience that these ideas do not depend on my will, and hence that they do not depend simply on me. Frequently, I notice them even when I do not want to. For example, I feel the heat whether I want to or not. And this is why I come to think that the sensation or idea of heat comes to me from something other than myself, namely the heat of the fire by which I am sitting. And the most obvious judgment for me to make is that the thing in question transmits to me its own likeness rather than something else. Okay. Berkeley, once again, esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. This is where we get the question, if the tree fell in the forest, would it make a noise? And if a man talks and there's no woman around to hear him, is he still wrong? Without someone there to perceive it, if the tree wouldn't exist in the first place, so it wouldn't make a noise either, I guess, according to Berkeley. The existence of things depends on something being conscious of them. Samuel Johnson, the famous wag of the 18th century, had what sometimes tongue-in-cheek called the argumentum ad lapidem, the argument from the stone. He kicks a stone, ouch! And he says, I refute him thus. That is, presumably I don't want the pain, so if I get the pain, it comes upon me adventitiously. That's something that testifies to the reality of the thing in question. There is a stone there. If it can hurt me, it must have some cause external to my mind. Of course, the pain could be self-induced, but is the pain really willed by my mind? Doesn't adversity suggest a cause outside of my mind? Descartes obviously is not speaking German, but the Germans have an interesting word here that bears on this question. If in German you want to say that something is objective as opposed to subjective, you say it is gegenständlich, it has Gegenständlichkeit, it is objectivity. And it comes from the root words gegen, which means against, and stand, as like in English to stand. So something which is objective stands against me, it resists my will, basically. Descartes expresses the same idea, not obviously using the German word. I feel the heat whether I want to or not. Heat burns. It does so regardless of what I think. So that tells me there's something out there, and maybe it's the fire, says Descartes, which I think is causing this heat, which is in fact causing this heat. On the other hand, Descartes has not met up with Dr. Freud. Okay. When you stub your toe, is that an accident? No, says Freud. That's punishment. You are punished for whatever reason. You're punishing yourself for something you did, and you're causing your toe to be injured, even though it comes to you as a surprise. You think it's adventitious. Self-sabotage is motivated. Well, if that's the case, then Descartes' point gets a little weaker. The fact that an object resists my will, that my perception of it may be caused by an agency outside itself, though, still does not guarantee that the idea I have of that object corresponds to it. So I kick a stone. Does the thing that hurts my toe look exactly like what I think it looks like? Maybe it's out there apart from me, Why does it look like a stone? I think the fire burns me, but does the thing which causes my burning sensation really resemble what I take to be the fire, which I take to be seeing through my senses? Maybe yes, maybe no. He continues, this is the bottom of page 504, the last new paragraph. I will now see if these arguments are strong enough. When I say nature has taught me to think this, all I mean is that a spontaneous impulse leads me to believe it, not that its truth has been revealed to me by some natural light. There's a big difference here. Whatever is revealed to me by the natural light, for example, that from the fact that I am doubting it follows I exist and so on, cannot in any way be open to doubt. This is because there cannot be another faculty both as trustworthy as the natural light and also capable of showing me that such things are not true. But as for my natural impulses, I've often judged in the past that they were pushing me in the wrong direction when it was a question of choosing good, and I do not see why I should place any greater confidence in them in other matters. Then again, although these ideas do not depend on my will, it does not follow that they must come from things located outside me. Just as the impulses of which I was speaking a moment ago seem opposed to my will, even though they are within me, so there may be some other faculty not yet fully known to me which produces these ideas without any assistance from external things. That is, after all, just how I've always thought ideas are produced in me when I was dreaming. And finally, even if these ideas did come from things other than myself, it would not follow that they must resemble these things. Indeed, I think I've often discovered a great disparity between an object and its idea in many cases. For example, I'll just kind of skip over that. Let's just repeat what I said before, but remember this, this picture which we've seen before in connection with Plato. What we think we see may not be caused by what we think causes it. May be a completely different cause that doesn't resemble it at all. For example, there are two different ideas of the sun which I find within me. One of them, which is acquired, as it were, from the senses, and which is a prime example of an idea which I reckon to come from an external source, makes the sun appear very small. The other idea is based on astronomical reasoning, that is, derived from certain notions which are innate in me, or else it is constructed by me in some other way. And this idea shows the sun to be several times larger than the Earth. So the idea that it's larger than the Earth is true. You could, don't do this with the sun, but you can do the same thing with the moon. You can hold up a nickel against a full moon and make it appear to be the same size. That is, it's casting the exact same retinal picture on your retina, basically, that the moon is. But of course, you know better because you're holding the one and the other is far away. So you understand it's a matter of perspective. But the naive perception would be that they're the same size. And if you correct that naive perception either with an idea of perspective or with some other ideas like he's talking about here, then you'll know that what the naive sensory experience seems to tell you is not, in fact, the true picture. Obviously, both these ideas cannot resemble the sun which exists outside me, and reason persuades me that the idea which seems to have emanated most directly from the sun itself has, in fact, no resemblance to it at all. All these considerations are enough to establish that it is not reliable judgment, but merely some blind impulse that has made me to believe up till now that there exist things distinct from myself which transmit to me ideas or images of themselves through the sense organs or in some other way. But it now occurs to me that there is another way of investigating whether some of the things of which I possess ideas exist outside me. Insofar as the ideas are considered simply as modes of thought, there is no recognizable inequality among them. They all appear to come from within me in the same fashion. But insofar as different ideas are considered as images which represent different things, it is clear that they differ widely. Undoubtedly, the ideas which represent substances to me amount to something more and, so to speak, contain within themselves more objective reality than the ideas which merely represent modes or accidents. Again, the idea that gives me an understanding of a supreme God, eternal, infinite, immutable, omniscient, omnipotent, and the creator of all things that exist apart from him, so transcendent God, certainly has in it more objective reality than the ideas that represent finite substances. Now it is manifest that there must be at least it's manifested by the natural light that there must be at least as much reality in the efficient and total cause as in the effect of the cause. For where, I ask, could the effect get its reality from, if not from the cause? And how could the cause give it to the effect unless it possessed it? It follows from this both that something cannot arise from nothing, and also that what is more perfect, that is, contains in itself more reality, cannot arise from what is less perfect. And this is transparently true, not only in the case of effects which possess what the philosophers call actual or formal reality, but also in the case of ideas, where one is considering only what they call objective reality. A stone, for example, which previously did not exist, cannot begin to exist unless it is produced by something which contains, either formally or immanently, everything to be found in the stone. Similarly, heat cannot be produced in an object which was not previously hot, except by something of at least the same order, degree, or kind of perfection as heat, and so on. But it is also true that the idea of heat or of a stone cannot exist in me unless it is put there by some cause which contains at least as much reality as I conceive to be in the heat or the stone. For although this cause does not transfer any of its actual or formal reality to my idea, it should not on that account be supposed that it must be less real. The nature of an idea is such that of itself it requires no formal reality except what it derives from my thought of which it is a mode. But in order for a given idea to contain such and such objective reality, it must surely derive it from some cause which contains at least as much formal reality as there is objective reality in the idea. For if we suppose that an idea contains something which was not in its cause, it must have got this from nothing. Yet the mode of being by which a thing exists subjective or representatively in the intellect by way of an idea, imperfect though it may be, is certainly not nothing, so it cannot come from nothing. Okay. That which is more perfect cannot arise from that which is less perfect. Heat cannot be produced in an object which was not previously hot, except by something of at least the same order, degree, or kind of perfection as heat, and so on. So, for example, you want to get water to boil. How do you do it? Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. You need something then, a source of heat, which is greater than 212 degrees Fahrenheit, which will transfer its perfection, although in a lesser form, less perfect way, to the water in question, which will bring it up to the boiling temperature, make it boil. Well, fire is up to 3,140 degrees Fahrenheit. So yeah, fire will do it. So if you put kettle on top of flame, then flame is going to transfer its immense, much more nearly perfect heat directly to the other object. And the heat will be a little less perfect, but it will be transferred because the cause of the transfer starts out being greater than the effect that it causes. A lesser can only be caused by a greater, right? Heat can only transfer heat something up. Wrong. Now, Descartes couldn't have known about this, but we all know about a microwave. Can you make tea in a microwave rather than on top of a stove? Yeah, you can. It's not the best way to do it, but you can do it and put your tea bag in and there you have tea. Because we know that heat is the release of energy, and we know about chemical bonds and the energy they contain. We have a whole atomic theory that explains to us how this process works. We don't see heating up a liquid as always, in every case, the transfer of heat from a hot object to something slightly less hot. The microwave doesn't get really hot on the inside. It's only, if you make something steam, that the steam, kind of warms it up. But it doesn't operate at all. It operates by bombarding the object with radiation and breaking some of its bonds. So, by the way, learned this trick in Boy Scouts. Do you know it's possible to boil an egg in a paper cup on hot coals, or a plastic cup now? We used to have Dixie cups back when I was in Boy Scouts. Yeah. And the cup will not burn as long as there's water in it, because for paper, at least, Fahrenheit 451, famously the novel by Ray Bradbury, is the combustion point of paper. And if water boils at 212 degrees, as long as there's water in there, it's not going to get hotter than 212 degrees, so it's not going to combust. Now, the edges, which are not, in contact with water, they might burn off, but any part of the cup which is in contact with water will get to the boiling point. If you have an egg in there, you can boil an egg when you're camping. See, whoever said you never learn anything useful in philosophy? But Descartes' principle is a lesser can only be caused by a greater. this is really old school. This doesn't understand the nature of the physical world, which we now have the luxury to understand. So come back to the stone, which I mentioned before. A stone, for example, which previously did not exist, cannot begin to exist unless it's produced by something which contains everything to be found in the stone. And again, the physics there is, in the natural history there, is kind of weird. We look at a stone and we see a small chunk chipped down and withered over the eons, but Descartes is still back in that world in which the Earth and the universe together are about 6,000 years old. On Mars, we see stones which are similarly weathered. We conclude that there was water flowing in Mars, and no doubt for quite some long time. Okay. Now, top of page 506, first new paragraph of the first column. And although the reality which I'm considering in my ideas is merely objective reality, I must not, on that account, suppose that the same reality need not exist formally in the causes of my ideas, but it is enough for it to be present in them objectively. For just as the objective mode of beings belongs to ideas by their very nature, so the formal mode belongs to the causes of ideas, or at least the first and most important ones, by their very nature. And although one idea may perhaps originate from another, there cannot be an infinite regress here. Eventually one must reach a primary idea, the cause of which will be like an archetype, which contains formally and in fact all the reality or perfection which is present only objectively or representatively in the idea. So it is clear to me, by the natural light, that the ideas in me are like pictures or images which can easily fall short of the perfection of the things from which they are taken, but which cannot contain anything greater or more perfect. The longer and more carefully I examine all these points, the more clearly and distinctly I recognize their truth. But what is my conclusion to be? If the objective reality of any of my ideas turns out to be so great that I'm sure the same reality does not reside in me, either formally or eminently, and hence that I myself cannot be its cause, it will necessarily follow that I am not alone in the world, but that some other thing which is the cause of this idea also exists. But if no such idea is to be found in me, I shall have no argument to convince me of the existence of anything apart from myself. For despite a most careful and comprehensive survey, this is the only argument which I so far been able to find. Okay, so something cannot be caused by something which is not more perfect than itself. Descartes thinks that the universe is in a process of entropy rather than a process of progress or emergence. We like to say we believe in progress in every day, in every way, and getting better and better. Descartes has a very different view of how history is working. It is a decline from the golden age. Things were more perfect in the past. The heat, which presumably conveys its perfection to the other objects, loses some of that perfection and winds down. Initial perfection degrades into gradual imperfection. And that's contrary to the notion of progress. The good old days are yet to come. For Descartes, history is a tale of entropy and degeneration. From an initial state of perfection, things are going to wind down. But might history move upward instead of downward? Evolution, for example, may be thought of as a sort of progress, but there may be no directionality to it. Stephen Jay Gould makes this point very, very forcefully. Later doesn't necessarily mean better. It just means there's been some development. So we might not necessarily be heading in the right direction, despite the fact that we're making progress. Emergence is when lesser complexity gives way to greater complexity. Descartes says this kind of thing just cannot happen. But the point is, entropy degradation is the opposite of either emergence or progress. What is emergence? Emergence is the way complex systems and patterns arise out of simpler ones. Weak emergence, or simpler components, weak emergence, or simple interactions, strong emergence. For example, the English language contains 26 elemental letters. Every single sentence in the English language, every single word, is made up of a combination of those same 26 building blocks. Whether you're reading Shakespeare or porn, it's all the same elements. Think about DNA. 4 elemental nucleobases, A, T, C, and G, in various permutations make up the genetic code for everything that is, was, or will be. Biological evolution is rife, therefore, with examples of emergence. Feathers grow out of hair, the same structure, basically. You get endoskeletons where there were exoskeletons. These are very different things, but there's a continuity. So life became more complex and diversified over time. That's what we know about the way that life developed. What we know about that stands very much at odds with the kind of view that Descartes is articulating, that there was perfection in the beginning and there's only degeneration winding down as time goes on. Descartes is completely clueless about the notion of emergence. And again, this is, Descartes says nothing can come from nothing. Well, we tend to disagree. The Big Bang, which is our current account of how the universe came into existence, something did come from nothing. Let's come back to this notion that the prior perfect only the prior perfect can be the cause of the subsequent imperfect. Now, Descartes is going to use this to get out of his solipsistic box. Remember that solipsistic problem, solipsism is the view that only I exist. So far, he has proven that he exists to his satisfaction, but nothing else yet. This is why he's now invoking God. Should I discover within myself an idea so great, so perfect, that little old me, imperfect little old me, could not have been its cause? Well, then I've discovered a being outside my mere subjective consciousness, which is the cause of my idea of that being, the perfect being about which I could not myself have caused. He goes on. This is the last new paragraph, bottom of the first column, page 506. Among my ideas, apart from the idea which gives me a representation of myself, which cannot present any difficulty in this context, there are ideas which variously represent God, corporeal and inanimate things, angels, animals, and finally, other men like myself. As far as concerns the ideas which represent other men or animals or angels, I have no difficulty in understanding that they could be put together from the ideas I have of myself, of corporeal things, and of God, even though the world contained no men besides me, no animals, and no angels. As to my ideas of corporeal things, I can see nothing in them which is so great or excellent as to make it seem impossible that it originated in myself. For if I scrutinize them thoroughly and examine them one by one, in the way which I examined the idea of the wax yesterday, I notice that the things which I perceive clearly and distinctly in them are very few in number. The list comprises size or extension in length, breadth, and depth, shape, which is a function of the boundaries of this extension, position, which is a relation between various items possessing shape, and motion or change in position. To these may be added substance, duration, and number. But as for all the rest, including lights and colors, sounds, smells, tastes, heat and cold, and the other tactile qualities, I think of these only in a very confused and obscure way, to the extent that I do not even know whether they are true or false. That is, whether the ideas I have of them are ideas of real things or non-things. For all those I've noted before, falsity in the strict sense, or formal falsity, can occur only in judgments. There is another kind of falsity, material falsity, which occurs in ideas when they represent non-things as things. For example, the ideas which I have of heat and cold contain so little clarity and distinctness that they do not enable me to tell whether cold is merely the absence of heat or vice versa, or whether both of them are real qualities or neither is. And since there can be no ideas which are not, as it were, of things, it is true that cold is nothing but the absence. If it is true that cold is nothing but the absence of heat, the idea which represents it to me as something real and positive deserves to be called false, and the same goes for other ideas of this kind. Okay. Can't tell whether heat is the absence of cold, cold is the absence of heat, whether it's something positive at all. Well, again, here, Descartes is at a disadvantage. He doesn't understand physics. We've actually settled that question. Cold is the absence of heat. How does your air conditioner work? It does so by evacuating heat, not by pumping in cool from the outside. So Descartes is just mistaken that this is an insoluble chicken and egg problem, he's trying to dismiss that by way of getting to God. He says, I don't know one way or another, so I can't say that this is going to be of any help. This is an example of what logicians would call an argument from ignorance. And an argument from ignorance is never a good idea, because what it says is, I don't know something, therefore I know something as a result of my ignorance. So take arguments about God. Can you prove that God exists? No, you can't. Well, then he doesn't exist. Oh, can you prove that God doesn't exist? No, well, then he exists. Okay, in either case, you're arguing from what you don't know to a conclusion about what you do know. That is a fallacious move. Now, Descartes wants to use his analogy about the priority between heat and cold in two different ways. It's an example of an idea which is unclear and indistinct. That is a bad idea, although we have since clarified it. Insofar as heat may be derivative of cold or vice versa, either concept has to be lacking in reality. On the other hand, I have the idea of God. Let's see where he goes with this. The first new paragraph, the second column, bottom of page 506. Such ideas obviously do not require me to posit a source distinct from myself. For on the one hand, if they are false, that is, represent non-things, I know by the natural light that they arise from nothing. That is, they are in me only because of the deficiency and lack of perfection in my nature. If, on the other hand, they're true, then since the reality which they represent is so extremely slight that I cannot even distinguish it from a non-thing, I do not see why they cannot originate within myself. With regard to the clear and distinct elements in my ideas of corporeal things, it appears that I could have borrowed some of these from my idea of myself, namely substance, duration, number, and anything else of this kind. For example, I think that a stone is a substance or is a thing capable of existing independently, and also think that I am a substance. Admittedly, I conceive of myself as a thing that thinks it is not extended, whereas I conceive of the stone as a thing that is extended and it does not think, so the two conceptions differ enormously. But they seem to agree with respect to the classification substance. Again, I perceive that I now exist and remember that I have existed for some time. Moreover, I have various thoughts which I can count. It is in these ways that I acquire the ideas of duration and number, which I can then transfer to other things. As for all the other elements which make up the idea of corporeal things, namely extension, shape, position, and movement, these are not formally contained in me, since I am nothing but a thinking thing. But since they are merely modes of a substance, and I am a substance, it seems possible that they are contained in me eminently. So there remains only the idea of God. And I must consider whether there's anything in the idea which could not have originated in myself. By the word God, I understand a substance that is infinite, eternal, immutable, independent, supremely intelligent, supremely powerful, and which created both myself and everything else, if anything else there be, that exists. All these attributes are such that the more carefully I concentrate on them, the less possible it seems that they could have originated from me alone. So from what has been said, it must be concluded that God necessarily exists. It is true that I have the idea of substance in me by virtue of the fact that I am a substance, but this would not account for my having the idea of an infinite substance when I'm finite, unless this idea proceeded from some substance which really was infinite. And I must not think that, just as my conceptions of rest and darkness are arrived at by negating movement and light, so my perception of the infinite is arrived at not by means of a true idea, but merely by negating the finite. On the contrary, I clearly understand that there is more reality in an infinite substance than in a finite one, and hence my perception of the infinite, that is God, is in some way prior to my perception of the finite, that is myself. For how could I understand that I doubted or desired, that is, lacked something, and that I was not wholly perfect, unless there were in me some idea of a more perfect being which enabled me to recognize my own defects by comparison? Nor can it be said that this idea of God is perhaps materially false and so could have come from nothing, which is what I just observed a minute ago in the case of ideas of hot and cold and so on. On the contrary, it is utterly clear and distinct and contains in itself more objective reality than any other idea. Hence, there is no idea which is in itself truer or less liable to be suspected of falsehood. This idea of a supremely perfect and infinite being is, I say, true in the highest degree. For although perhaps one may imagine that such a being does not exist, it cannot be supposed that the idea of such a being represents something unreal, as I said with regard to the idea of cold. The idea is, moreover, utterly clear and distinct. For whatever I clearly and distinctly perceive as being true and real, and implying any perfection, is wholly contained in it. It does not matter that I do not grasp the infinite, or that there are countless additional attributes of God which I cannot in any way grasp and perhaps cannot even reach in my thought, for it is in the nature of the infinite not to be grasped by a finite being like myself. It is enough that I understand the infinite, that I judge that all the attributes which I clearly perceive and know to imply some perfection, and perhaps countless others of which I am ignorant, are present in God either formally or eminently. This is enough to make the idea of God, that I have of God, the truest and most clear and distinct of all my ideas. But perhaps, he's always going to play devil's advocate here. Always got a perhaps. But perhaps I'm something greater than I myself understand, and all the perfections which I attribute to God are somehow in me, potentially, though not yet emerging or actualized. For I'm now experiencing a gradual increase in my knowledge, and I see nothing to prevent its increasing more and more to infinity. Further, I see no reason why I should not be able to use this increased knowledge to acquire all the other perfections of God. And finally, if the potentiality for these perfections is already within me, why should this not be enough to generate the idea of such perfections? But all this is impossible. First, though it is true that there is a gradual increase in my knowledge, and that I have many potentialities which are not yet actual, this is all quite irrelevant to the idea of God, which contains absolutely nothing that is potential. Indeed, this gradual increase in knowledge is itself the surest sign of imperfection. What is more, even if my knowledge always increases more and more, I recognize that it will never be actually infinite, since it will never reach the point where it is not capable of further increase. God, on the other hand, I take to be actually infinite, so that nothing can be added to his perfection. And finally, I perceive that the objective being of an idea cannot be produced merely by potential being, which strictly speaking is nothing, but only by actual or formal being. So Aquinas and others had said this earlier: God has no potentiality, he's all actuality. Descartes entertains the question, maybe I could be God, When I pray, I find I'm talking to myself. Could be. But no, I can't, because if I am getting more and more perfect, then I am imperfect. And God is always perfect, actually. Never could have an increase in perfection, never could learn. Remember, God's TV channel, it's all reruns. There's nothing more for him to find out. He knows it all. He's omniscient. Descartes continues, if one concentrates carefully, all this is quite evident by the natural light. But when I relax my concentration and my mental vision is blinded by the images of things perceived by the senses, it is not so easy for me to remember why the idea of being more perfect than myself must necessarily proceed from some being which is in reality more perfect. I should therefore like to go further and inquire whether I myself, who have this idea, could exist if no such being existed. From whom in that case would I derive my existence? From myself, presumably, or from my parents, or from some other beings less perfect than God? For nothing more perfect than God, or even as perfect, can be thought of or imagined. There's St. Anselm again. From whom in that case would I derive my existence? Oh, sorry, just read that. Yet, if I derive my existence from myself, then I should neither doubt nor want, nor lack anything at all. For I should have given myself all the perfections of which I have any idea, and thus I should myself be God. I must not suppose that the items I lack would be more difficult to acquire than those I now have. On the contrary, it is clear that, since I am a thinking thing or substance, it would have been far more difficult for me to emerge out of nothing than merely to acquire knowledge of the many things of which I am ignorant, such knowledge being merely an accident of that substance. And if I had derived my existence from myself, which is a greater achievement, I should certainly not have denied myself the knowledge in question, which is something much easier to acquire, or indeed any of the other attributes which I perceive to be contained in the idea of God, for none of them seem any harder to achieve. And if any of them were harder to achieve, they would certainly appear so to me if I had indeed got all my other attributes from myself, since it should experience a limitation of my power in this respect. I do not escape the force of these arguments by supposing that I have always existed as I do now, as if it followed from this that there was no need to look for any author of my existence. For a lifespan can be divided into countless parts, each completely independent of the others, so that it does not follow from the fact that I existed a little while ago that I must exist now, unless there is some cause which, as it were, it creates me afresh at this moment, that is, which preserves me. For it is quite clear to anyone who attentively considers the nature of time that the same power and action are needed to preserve anything at each individual moment of its duration, as would be required to create that thing anew, as if it were not yet in existence. Hence, the distinction between preservation and creation is only a conceptual one. And this is one of the things that are evident to me by the natural light. Okay. So there's more reality in an infinite substance than a finite one. Therefore, the infinite must be the source of the notion of finite. And yet, etymologically, if you look at that, that's just backwards. The word is infinite, that is, not finite. The word suggests that we get our concept of infinity by a conceptual negation, a mental negation of what we know of finitude. So it does indeed seem to be derivative, etymologically, just contrary to what Descartes says. Doesn't his argument seem to be at cross purposes here? On the one hand, finite little me can only grasp the idea of infinite as an object of ignorance. On the other hand, my grasp of God, the infinite, is the clearest and most distinct of my ideas, and therefore the truest idea. He again is borrowing here, as I said just earlier, from St. Thomas. Potentiality is not a characteristic of God. God is complete actuality. No potency is to be found in his substance. What if these things, though, are in me, though only just potentially? I'm a potential millionaire. I have $1. Longevity is the first step on the road to immortality. Maybe I'm God, like Jack Gurney in Peter O'Toole's character Jack Gurney in the film The Ruling Class. How do I know I'm God? Because when I pray to him, I find I'm talking to myself. But my own knowledge emerges gradually. For God, this wouldn't be the case, so I suppose maybe I'm not God after all. And my existence must be sustained. Descartes seems to think that everything is stochastic. The same power and action are needed to preserve anything at each individual moment of its duration as would be required to create a thing anew if it were not yet in existence. Stochastic processes, ones which do not depend on previous states. So, for example, if you flip a coin and it comes up heads, what's the probability it's going to come up heads the next flip? 50-50. What's the probability it's going to come up heads the next flip? 50-50. Now, having a long series of heads in succession is in general improbable, but the outcome of having flipped the coin the first time does not influence the second or third or subsequent flip. They're all independent one of another. The notion that this doesn't work that way is called the gambler's fallacy. My number's about to come up, it's time, I'm due. No. But if you're dealing with a stochastic process, and not all processes are, Descartes seems to think that they are, that everything is stochastic. So life is stochastic, not self-maintaining. I cannot maintain my own life, therefore God exists because he's the one that continually recreates me and his providence oversees me, and so on and so forth. Willie and Joe in the Foxhole in World War II. I'm a fugitive from the law of averages, right? It's only a matter of time before one of those bullets hits me instead of whizzes by me. When my number's up, it's up. There's a law of averages which says it's going to get me. The problem is there is no law of averages. As I said before about the dice and the coin toss. A stochastic process, again, one in which a subsequent event is completely independent of a previous event. So, toss a coin, it's 2 heads to a coin, 50-50 chance that one side is going to come up as opposed to the other. The other side's going to come up as opposed to the one. Next toss, exactly the same chance, all the way down. Now, improbable things can happen. Heads can come up 5 times, 10 times in a row. Not often, but it can happen. Here's an example. October 2010, exactly the same set of numbers came up in the Israeli lottery as came up 6 weeks before. The odds were 1 in 4 trillion. That's highly improbable, but it can happen. Okay. We chase a shaggy dog here. The probability of each of us being here is very, very low, and yet each of us is here. You know, what if your mother had conceived the month before she conceived you? Well, then you wouldn't even be a thought. What if you had not been conceived and she'd conceived a child a month after you? You would not be a thought. So there are lots of, I guess, potential human beings that could be conceived, but the vast majority of them don't get conceived. Once they get conceived and born, then there's all kinds of probabilities about their surviving and so on and so forth. The shaggy dog story is this. My parents were married in June of 1950. Today's the 15th. They were married on the 14th. So that was their wedding anniversary yesterday. And no, I'm not older than 70 years old. 2 weeks after their wedding, my father got orders to go to Japan. This is 1950, middle of 1950. And back in those days, the Army had its own ships. They didn't fly people over in planes yet, as they did in Vietnam, for example. Halfway across the Pacific, the Korean War breaks out. So my father's ship docks in Yokohama. There's an MP cordon around the ship. Nobody goes on, nobody gets off. Personnel people come on board, and they start asking questions. Now, my father at this point had been in the Army for 10 years. He would serve for full 30 years before he retired. 10 years. First thing he learned in the Army in 1940 was keep your eyes open, your mouth shut, and don't volunteer. One of the questions they asked personnel people is, anybody have any newspaper experience? Yeah, my father said, I used to work on a paper back home. Okay, you, and you, my father included, off the ship, your baggage will follow. Ship got turned around, and these were clerks and typists, a lot of older guys. Some of them hadn't even fired an M1, which is our main battle rifle at the time, semi-auto rifle. They trained on the old bolt-action Springfields. They gave them M1s, put them in the line, baptized them as infantry. That night, there was a human wave attack. Every one of those men was dead the next morning. And my father only survived because he opened his big fat mouth, despite his better judgment. So the odds of me being here could have turned on a dime. The odds of any of us being here could have turned on, and have turned on a dime. So yes, we're all very improbable, but the improbable can happen. Now, as opposed to the lives people lead, some lives are stochastic. Okay, so if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, the opening scene, Dog Green sector, Omaha Beach, probably pretty much what went on. A lot of people died. A few of them survived, improbably enough. And that was D-Day. Then there was D+1. Then there was D+2. And every single day you've got to survive that day. And if you know the story, Private Ryan, by D-Day +10, pretty much those guys that survived are all wiped out. That happened to a lot of men. And so, you can walk now in Normandy between the crosses row on row. And these guys were in a stochastic situation, and they really had to do it all over again each and every single day. Most jobs are not like MOS 11 Bravo. Gilbert goes to work every day and he still got his job. And so the probability he's going to have his job has something to do with how he performed the day before. So it's not a stochastic process. It doesn't have to be renewed constantly, as Descartes seems to think that everything in life is. And if it's false that everything is always stochastic, Descartes' argument that God is necessary begins to fall apart. Let's see. Nor can it be supposed, we're at page 509, the second new paragraph in the first column. Nor can it be supposed that several partial causes contribute to my creation, or that I receive the idea of one of the perfections which I attribute to God from one cause, and the idea of another from another. The supposition here being that all the perfections are to be found somewhere in the universe, but not joined together in one single being, God. On the contrary, the unity, simplicity, or the inseparability of all the attributes of God is one of the most important of the perfections which I understand him to have. And surely the idea of the unity of all his perfections could not have been placed in me by any cause which did not also provide me with the idea of the other perfections. For no cause could have made me understand the interconnection and inseparability of the perfections without at the same time making me recognize what they were. Lastly, as regards my parents, even if everything I've ever believed about them is true, it is certainly not they who preserved me, and insofar as I am a thinking thing, they did not even make me. They merely place certain dispositions in the matter, which I've always regarded as containing me, or rather in my mind, for that is all I now take myself to be. Because if he's just a mind, why does he even have parents? He doesn't answer that question. So there can be no difficulty regarding my parents in this context. Altogether then, it must be concluded that the mere fact that I exist and have within me an idea of the most perfect being, that is God, provides a very clear proof that God indeed exists. It only remains for me to examine how I received this idea from God. For I did not acquire it from the senses. It has never come to me unexpectedly, as usually happens with the idea of things that are perceivable by the senses, when these things present themselves to the external sense organs or seem to do so. And it was not invented by me either, for I am plainly unable either to take away anything from it or to add anything to it. The only remaining alternative is that it is innate in me, just as the idea of myself is innate in me. And indeed, it is no surprise that God, in creating me, should have placed this idea in men to be, as it were, the mark of the craftsman stamped on his work. Not that the mark need be anything distinct from the work itself. But the mere fact that God created me is a very strong basis for believing that I am somehow made in his image and likeness, and that I perceive that likeness, which includes the idea of God, by the same faculty which enables me to perceive myself. That is, when I turn my mind's eye upon myself, I understand that I am a thing which is incomplete and dependent on another, and which aspires without limit to ever greater and better things. But I also understand at the same time that he on whom I depend has within him all those greater things, not just indefinitely and potentially, but actually and infinitely, and hence that he is God. The whole force of the argument lies in this. I recognize that it would be impossible for me to exist with the kind of nature I have, that is, having within me the idea of God, were it not the case that God really existed. By God, I mean the very being, the idea of whom is within me, that is the possessor of all the perfections which I cannot grasp, but can somehow reach in my thought, who is subject to no defects whatsoever. It is clear enough from this that he cannot be a deceiver, since it is manifest by the natural light that all fraud and deception depend on some defect. And yet Descartes earlier said that God does allow us to be deceived at some point. But before examining this point more carefully and investigating other truths which may be derived from it, I should like to pause here and spend some time in contemplation of God, to reflect on his attributes, to gaze with wonder and adoration on the beauty of this immense light, so far as the eye of my darkened intellect can bear it. For just as we believe through faith that the supreme happiness of the next life consists solely in the contemplation of the divine majesty, so experience tells us that this same contemplation, albeit much less perfect, enables us to know the greatest joy of which we are capable in this life. And so he ends the third meditation on that pious note. And we won't read beyond that. He has 3 more meditations, but I think you've gotten at this. If you're going to get it, you've got at this point the sense of where Descartes is coming from, as well as where he's going. If he can prove that God exists, that he's proven that there is a mind outside himself, he's proven that there is an objective reality outside himself, then he can go on and try to build on that foundation. Remember, he wants to build some other subsequent beliefs upon that, including perhaps all the truths of physics, all the truths of astronomy, all the truths that previously he had come to doubt, in fact. Whether he gets there is a good question. He thinks that he does. We'll see subsequently. Most people have not agreed with Descartes on that. Okay, so life is always stochastic, but it seems not to be. If it's false, that it always is. Descartes' argument for God is weakened. Do I possess some power enabling me to bring it about that I who now exist will still exist a little while from now? But I experience no such power, and this fact makes me recognize that I depend on a higher power. Jean-Paul Sartre, for one, would dispute Descartes here. You have the power. You are the only one who has this power. Also, Descartes mentions that he's close. He's very close to the idea of God, and he thinks that is an argument. Gives him an argument for the reality of God as an independent being. Later on, the very last lecture of this term, when we talk about Feuerbach, we'll see that Feuerbach takes exactly the same observation to precisely the opposite conclusion, but that's down the road a ways. And Sartre, in approaching Descartes, would go further. Consciousness expects no ending. It's always projecting itself into the future with no end in sight. Consciousness expects constancy to the point of immortality. It doesn't expect that present existence implies an unending, contrary to Descartes, an unending future. It's only the body which demands death by wearing down. And the mismatch between consciousness, which expects to be infinite, and the body, which expects to wind down, is a very marked one, and Sartre makes a lot of that. Consciousness finds the demand of wearing down and coming to an end just wholly intolerable and unreasonable, and it fights the prospect of its own mortality. Descartes says, I experience no such power. Sartre says, we all experience this power. It's part of what it means to be conscious. The unity, the simplicity, or the inseparability of all the attributes of God is one of the most important perfections which I, Descartes, understand him to have. But again, are the attributes of God really all that simple? We've talked about this before when we talked about metaphysics, for example, the notion of the attributes of God, omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection, omnibenevolence. The problem of theodicy. This is just kind of to summarize some stuff. From the premises that only prior perfection can cause subsequent imperfection, the entropy assumption, I have within me the idea of infinity, but as a finite being, I cannot be the cause of this idea. We've seen etymologically that has a problem. I cannot sustain my existence, but need ongoing sustenance from some other being distinct from myself. We've seen also where that is questionable. The mere fact that I exist and have within me the idea of a most perfect being, that is God, provides me a very clear proof that God indeed exists. Well, that's kind of review. The whole force of this argument lies in this. I recognize that it would be impossible for me to exist with the kind of nature I have, that is, having within me the idea of God, were it not the case that God really existed. It's clear enough from this that he cannot be a deceiver, since it is manifest by the natural light that all fraud and deception depend on some defect. Really? Well, it might not be manifest to all. Fraud and deception may be defects measured by human morality, but why should God go by that? If God deceives us and he has his own inscrutable reasons for this, why wouldn't he do that? Descartes expects that God is going to measure up to our ideas of perfection. John Calvin, for example, would want to dispute that. Remember the discussion about Euthyphro. We are in danger of some serious circular reasoning here when Descartes tries to prove the existence of God as the linchpin of his metaphysics. Why are clear and distinct perceptions reliable? Because God exists as a non-deceiver. Why does God exist? Because clear and distinct perceptions are reliable. Okay, so Descartes is not what he thought he was cracked up to be, perhaps, would be the conclusion we would take away. Okay, if that's the case, there's an annoying question that follows, which is, why are we still reading this guy? Yeah? After all these years, why do we still read Descartes? Well, the bit about the wax makes sense. It's kind of clever. He takes the psychological experience of sense perception, and he says, no, I don't deny that we have these, but the nature of sense perception isn't what we usually take it to be. Sense perception is itself a mental event. So he gives a rationalist explanation to our experience of empirical things. On the other hand, the bit about the pineal gland is just nonsense. It's kind of like saying the heart is the seat of emotion, so, in that sort of level. We know what these bodily organs do. It's not those things. The circularity is bad. The Aristotelian residue is bad. The pre-scientific bits, about heat and cold and how heat is just the transfer of something more perfect to something less perfect. Descartes' foundationalism is passé. I didn't go into this a lot, but this is one thing that's been criticized, particularly in recent decades. His armchair rationalism also has its flaws, something we talked about earlier. So, as we've seen then, there are some defects and difficulties all along in Descartes' arguments. Some of them would have been apparent to his contemporaries, but some of them only become clear after the fact. We stand on the shoulders of giants, as it were. We do see things more clearly. We know much more basic true stuff about how nature operates, the nature of heat exchange and, heat and cold and emergence and all that kind of stuff. So is it a little unfair to tax Descartes with not having been born in our times? You know, here's a painting by Jean-Baptiste Greuze, The Laundress, La Blanchisseuse. And if he were only thinking straight, he would have updated it, right? Wouldn't the laundress really need a washing machine? Well, that's what we call anachronism. It's never fair to judge anachronistically. It's not fair to judge Descartes for having been a 17th century thinker and not a 21st century thinker. We have advantages that he didn't have. But we see what we see. Our advantages are still advantages. What we know about physics, anatomy, etc., tells us that Descartes is unreliable for us, and it tells us also why. But we might say of Descartes, as of Plato, as of St. Anselm, even if they didn't succeed on their own terms, they were pretty clever boys. And they failed, but they failed gloriously. What does Winnie the Pooh say? Having the right answer can be a highly overrated experience. And nobody believes the substance of things that Plato, or for that matter, Aristotle said, but they got the ball rolling, and they were clever, For St. Anselm to come up with that idea about the existence of God being necessary, it was a stroke of genius. And, almost nobody would endorse that nowadays, but, you got to admire his audacity, you got to admire his skill. And Descartes, I think you could say the same thing. There is a standard way in which philosophy students often fail. They don't fail at their degrees, but they fail at philosophy itself. And that is this. It's possible to master all the ins and outs of arguments of any given philosopher. And if you do the history of philosophy, you're going to have to do a lot of them. And to see their many flaws. And yet, at the same time, to fail to understand the point of what they were trying to do and what they contributed to the process in their day and age, even if it may not hold up for the ages. Brian McGee, we heard from Brian McGee. Well, actually, no, we heard about it. We'll hear about him from him in another context. But he makes an interesting observation in this regard about missing the point. I had a pupil who turned in a couple of well-crafted essays on Descartes, subjecting the cogito ergo sum to effective and damaging criticism, putting his figure on the weaknesses of the so-called proofs of the existence of God, pointing out the circularity of the overall layout of his argument. His perceptions of what was wrong with Descartes were many and acute and on the whole accurate, and his essays were stylishly written and soundly constructed. Having got to this point, he expected to go on and do the same with the next philosopher. This is the sort of thing the best students did, and it was thought to be Oxford intellectual training at its most sophisticated, as indeed it is. McGee was up for a while at Keble College, I think also Wilson. But I said to him, if all the criticisms you've made of Descartes are valid, and on the whole I think they are, why are we spending our time here now discussing him? Why have you just devoted a fortnight of your life to reading his main works and writing 2 essays about them? More to the point, if all these things are wrong with his ideas, and I think they are, why is his name known to every educated person in the Western world today, 3.5 centuries after his death? Why are his writings studied in every major university in the world as they're being studied by you and me here now? Why are clever people willing to devote years of their lives to writing books about him? It is a very good question. So again, one of the reasons we still read Descartes is the reason we still read Plato or St. Anselm. They were very clever. We have some things to learn from them. And in addition, as Bettany Hughes has said of Socrates, we think the way we do because he thought the way he did. I think McGee's point is we could say the same thing about Descartes. So however we may assess Descartes' substantive success or failure, I think we can appreciate what he thought he was doing. First of all, he wanted to establish foundations, firm foundations for knowledge. And he did so by a counterintuitive skepticism, doubt everything. He was skeptical in the interest precisely of eliminating skepticism in the end. And having dared to do that, he discovered there was in fact one thing he could not doubt, hence his cogito argument. The cogito solved problems whether we can know anything at all, but he did so at the price of painting himself into a solipsistic corner. And so that's why he comes to God in this third meditation. He's trying to get out of that corner by showing that there's at least one being distinct from himself, which does exist because it must exist. And thinking that he succeeded in this, he'll go on to try establishing that there are other objects in the world, and that general knowledge is possible in this foundationalist way. It's a very ambitious and cleverly crafted program, whether it works or not. Okay, so I hope now that you have some understanding of Descartes. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to move on. Descartes was the first modern philosopher. We're going to move on to the German idealist tradition, and we're going to start with Immanuel Kant, who in many ways is like Descartes, certainly in starting from the subjective consciousness and trying to work forward and outward from there. I entitled the next lecture, tongue-in-cheek, German Idealism from Descartes to Sartre. Descartes and Sartre being anything but Germans. But it seems to me that the tradition of German idealism, which is a very important one, does owe a lot to Descartes' initial move. He is indeed the first modern philosopher in that respect. And then we'll go on from there to talk about some aspects of the German idealist tradition. We're going to read Hegel's Phenomenology. That's the last text we're going to read this semester. And then I want to talk a bit in the very final lecture about some of the fallout from Hegel in the 19th century, Ludwig Feuerbach, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, but also the way in which Hegel, in that very short passage we're going to read from his book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, anticipates so much that's going to happen in the social sciences in the 20th and 21st centuries, particularly in the area of social psychology. So that's what's up next. We'll go to German idealism from Descartes to Sartre. So that's it for today. Good day, and I will see you next lecture.